of the Arcane Archive presents MetaTalks. You are, of course, joined here today with your amazing, illustrious hosts, Adam
and Sam.
And we are once again going to talk everyone's ears off incessantly about our very, very spicy correct opinions on
is that what
everything.
This is?
Yeah, that's obviously that's always what this has been. Clearly, on everything tabletop role playing or even,
infallible opinions.
And completely correct, never wrong, never disputable in any way, shape, or form. All right.
Yeah, you can't prove I'm wrong, so
obviously you can't objectively prove that I'm incorrect. So therefore, I'm right always.
There you go.
But for today's meta talk topic, Sammy, would you like to tell the people what we'll be meta talk talking about today?
Yeah, we were thinking about continuing the last topic we were on, which was kind of general problems at the DM's table from whatever realm they come from. Our last video we did on this, I think both of us had some stuff that we left off the table due to time constraints in the real world.
We had to cut things
Therefore,
short a little bit.
I think, there's enough of us that we still want to talk about, plus some stuff that I had asked Adam about before today, just kind of see if that would also fit in. So I think our whole thing is just kind of continuing about where we left off. I will say, I guess I'll apologize on both of our behalves if we repeat anything in the last episode.
We probably will,
because it's been a minute, and lots of things go on, and sometimes your brain forgets the things you like to talk about.
Life has been a real something for a while now. Like, I don't know if you guys maybe have noticed a couple of changes here or there throughout our videos, but there's been a lot of stuff that's been going on, so apologies for any drop in either quality or whatever else, if there ever was quality to begin with. But
Adam, you can't talk like that. You can't talk like that.
I am my own worst critic, I've been told many times. So hey, if everyone else is kind of enjoying things, then I'm happy. But either way, that being the case, y'all, let's go ahead and just jump right on in. We don't want to have a similar run of last time and run out of time before we get through all of our stuff. Since we have, we have a knack for ranting and prattling on incessantly. But with that being said, let's go ahead and kind of, I think, pick off where I recall last time. We essentially were still talking a little bit about, some archetypes of problematic scenarios, situations, players. And we wanted to, I believe, also get into a little bit more in depth about problematic GMs as well. Mm-hmm. I think we already went over a number of kind of some of the archetypes of problem players, and maybe I should even just stipulate saying more so just specific aspects that can be maybe a little bit problematic in gaming groups. I think we went over, and if not, we'll just do a really quick recap. There's people who like to get into the game who can maybe be a little bit too enthusiastic, who can be maybe a little bit too gung-ho about really trying to play their character, really trying to make sure that their character is shown, seen, that they are able to act out their backstory, their abilities, all this stuff. And this person can often kind of be taken as a spotlight hog, or a main character syndrome is a very common trope. One thing about that is, I believe we already have touched on it, but just again to say, is this person is not necessarily always 100% a bad person in terms of they just care about themselves or just being selfish, just being honestly, a lot of the time it can be very normal for them to just feel they just feel so excited, and they want to make sure that their character is played, and so they get a little overzealous, and they can be a little bit inconsiderate of some others sometimes.
Not to be that guy, it's theater kid syndrome.
a little bit.
Yeah. It's not a bad thing. And I'll tell you this, if you play the game long enough, or you really start to care about your table or your character or the game that you're playing, you can kind of get into that. There's definitely points in my playing, and me personally, I'm far from theater kid material. It is.
I think you're much more theater kid than you give yourself credit.
But that was never something. I never had that push, and so the reality is even those of us who maybe start a little bit more reserved and kind of come into a space where you then feel a lot more confident, you can't, like, the important thing is you have to give everyone a chance. We kind of touched on some of the stuff that I had problems with at some of my tables, where we felt like, you know, certain parts of the group weren't pulling their weight role play wise, and it led those of us who were to be more boisterous. That's not always the answer, because now you're not even giving those people a chance to come in. So it's one of those things. It's a simple solution. You have to take a step back and look, is everyone getting a chance to play their character? Because even if people have a different style, as long as everyone gets a piece of the pie, I think that's enough of a fix. Because there are just different people. There's different types of role
Different play
players.
styles, yeah.
Yeah.
Like we can even say the inverse of maybe this particular archetype is the opposite, right? The person who, like you were talking about in the previous episode, you know, people maybe who don't role play at all, who don't see any real desire to like get in there to talk. It's maybe even just about the numbers, you know, it's just about the pure mechanics of the game where they can like go in, they can just destroy, kill things, like use their abilities, their powers or whatever to like see those numbers just fly up into the air, right? And that's, again, we want to stress that there is not necessarily any implicitly wrong way to play the game. You know, the only wrong way to play the game is if you're not having fun, right? Like that's the only real objectively wrong way to play D&D.
It's about how things mesh.
Yeah, if you have a game, if you have people who are just looking for that, they're all just looking like, you know what? Yeah, I want to utilize my character's abilities, the things I see on the sheet. I want to do all that stuff, and you don't give a crap about any other aspect of the game, like exploration or role play. It's like, all right, you know what? Fair enough. That is your prerogative. You are welcome to do that as long as you are having fun and the people who are involved are all having a good time. Now, you know, I think for me and Sam, we both agree that for us, that would not be the ideal situation to be in for us to really have optimized fun.
Look, don't get me wrong, a battle royale would be a fun 2-week fun. You know, it'd be fun to do that.
But
for
it's
a
like
session.
that's like a 1-shot, 2-shot maybe kind of.
But
deal
I don't want to do that every week or
like
every 2 weeks.
A long form campaign. And again, like I said, you can do it maybe like dungeon crawl, right? It's a dungeon crawl specific type of game where you just go into the dungeon, you go through rooms and encounters, you just deal with that with your abilities, and then you're done. It's like, okay, that type of game could be fun too sometimes. But me and Sam definitely like to get more into the meat of things. But that being the case, again, we're going off a little bit of a side tangent here. Already. That type of player who is maybe in a game where people are wanting to be more like balanced in the three pillars. Having a player who is maybe a little bit more just like, can even be a bit of a know-it-all or be like a bit of a hey, that character isn't optimized, or you can't, you know, and I think I suffer from this a bit too at times. Is like, you know, optimization isn't always explicitly necessary either, especially if maybe your character who is messed up or isn't working very well still, again, maybe has some life, some personality to them. Like that can be the change, right? Because it's like, it's one thing, for instance, I think I gave this example as well maybe last time, but I'll do it again just as a refresher. Like there, in my first ever D&D game that I played, there was one player who came in and she built a ranger in the game, and how she built it was, you know, absolutely not good at all. It was completely unoptimized. Like she dumped most of her stats into charisma for whatever weird reason. Her dex was like super low. She didn't have particularly high con either. Like her intelligence was really high for whatever reason too. Like it was just not at all a well, like for a ranger, statted out just in that way. But you know, she initially did because she's like, well, I want to be charismatic and I want to like I want people to like me and I want to, you know, so it's like, okay, cool. The only issue with that though is that her character was also just very standoffish. She was not particularly extroverted or interactive or social. She was very like paranoid, suspicious of people and not trusting and didn't like, so it was like, and then whenever we get into combat, she would often complain about not ever being able to hit anything or do anything really. And it was like, well, because your character was not statted out well. And so eventually our GM took pity on her and they restatted her character to make more sense overall for her and what she was doing. And that, you know, that in essence, I just say as a good example of like, hey, this is something, and someone who's like, if there's an issue or problem, obviously the GM should be the one to hopefully help out and be able to be open and accepting or giving of, like, you know, trying to tweak some things to make the game more fun for a player, especially if they're new. Again, to her credit, she was brand new to playing the game, really. So she had never really done it before. And so that's understandable, and that's perfectly fair and okay. And that those situations and those scenarios are absolutely what a GM should be on the lookout for, to be like, hey, you know, it's like that's one of the biggest things I have about like rolling, for instance, for rolling for like stats and stuff. You know what I mean? Where it's just like you have a chance to roll really good to get really high stats. You have a chance to roll really shitty and roll really bad stats. It's like if you roll just absolutely abysmal stats, then I feel like you should either be able to then choose to do like point buy or slash standard or whatever, or re-roll potentially.
Yeah, there are, you know, in just kind of the community of D&D, there are lots of homebrew, you know, house rules of like, well, if you roll stats and you don't hit this number at least in your total stat rolls, you re-roll. Yeah, we do that at our table. If you don't beat, I think it's like a 71 or something, 72, something like that.
Because that's literally the standard array. Like,
if it doesn't hit at least standard array, then you don't roll again.
Yeah.
Now, what my DM has done that I think is a really good way to keep it from being spiteful from one player to another, we roll stats together, so we all roll 2 stat lines, like as a group. Each person like rolls a dice, whatever. Those 2 stat lines, we as a group vote which one we want to take, and everyone has to use the same collection of numbers. Now we can put them wherever we want, we can do whatever we want with it, but the reason he does that is so that when you, like, if someone dies, they make a new character, you already have the stats there. You start with the
and everybody starts on basically the same
playing field. Yeah,
which is as similar as doing like a standard array, but just potentially, with higher like stats.
It's the potential of being able to make something a little bit more specialized or make something a little bit weird. Because the problem with standard array and stuff like that is it can be a little limiting for certain classes.
I mean,
like I think standard array and point buy is bad for monk. The only reason being is that monk really needs 3 stats to do well, and you don't really get that. The reality is, I think at the end of the day, like, I don't have a problem if players want flaws in a character. You know, having a dumb stat or having some sort of thing that sets them back in a way is fantastic. When someone completely is unoptimized, I have a hard time playing with those players. The reason being is either they don't know, but they think they're doing it right, which is very frustrating, or they do know and they're intentionally creating a character that is completely useless at a table. I've had this happen before at times, and most of the time it was from people who didn't really know. Which is fine. We talked about it, we fixed it, whatever. But
I was gonna say that is usually probably what that is based. The majority of the people who maybe have not the best stats are usually people who maybe just don't really understand.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'm a little bit toxic in this, but it's the reality is, it's like, if I'm gonna be playing a game, a cooperative storytelling game with a group of people, and one of the people in my group is completely useless at all 3 pillars because they are so unoptimized that they just don't ever roll well or participate in anything meaningfully, I don't want to play with that person. Now, that's my own issue. You could call me out for that. I am gladly going to take that criticism. But the reality being is, like, having a flaw is one thing. Being useless at a table...
Well,
why are you here?
I was gonna say, it brings up that exact question on, like, hey, like, because I also have to wonder, like, okay, are you really wanting to play the game then? Like, are you really here to play the game, or are you just kind of here? And I told in my kind of origin story from last time, that's what I told, was like, a lot of people in our original game would kind of just like show up and not really play. You know, they would talk about other things even though the rest of us would be there, or they wouldn't show up consistently, and it would just it was kind of just a mess. And so I often also like just wonder, I'm like, when you play a game, like when you come here to do this specific activity, this activity as well, that usually takes a vast, even maybe astronomical sometimes, amount of prep and scheduling and workarounds and
time commitment,
planning and commitment. It's like, don't you want to do this thing?
Yeah. We
can just get together and hang out kind of anytime, like in this other way. Like, we can just do that. Usually, if you really are so wanting to do that. But with this, it's like, this is something that's like, hey, this takes a lot of effort a lot of the time, at least to do it well, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if we're gonna do it, then let's do this thing. And you know, that being the case, it's like we have players that is another kind of archetype of players who are like, they're here to, you know, hang out socially rather than actually play the game. And once again, if you have people who are like wanting to do that, who like that is what they are wanting to do, that is what they want to just kind of chill, they don't really want to think too hard or play the game too many, you know, they just want to like drink some alcohol, maybe smoke a bit, you know, like whatever, and just kind of turn their brains off. It's like, okay, once again, that's all right. Like if that is the type of game that you guys want to do and you have that's your group, then that's great and fine. The issue then occurs when you have that conflict or that clash of two separate types of players, right?
Yeah.
Who are all looking to like, well, I want to do it this way, or I want to do it this way. And the obviously difficulty comes with trying to reconcile with all of that, right? With trying to basically be like, okay, how do you then work off of these two kind of conflicting mindsets to the game, where you're trying to like, you know, you are trying to play it this way and this other person is trying to play it this way. So that being the case, I would suggest a couple of different like ideas is, you know, you will obviously, I feel like this also really does come from like the GM, right? The GM is also very much responsible for like, hey, setting the expectation of what this like campaign is supposed to be, and what this campaign is really doing. Is this more of a casual kind of just, yeah, we're just getting together to kind of, you know, screw around, have a good time, whatever, like we don't really need to think too hard, we're not trying to whatever? Or is this more of a, you know, hey, yeah, we're trying to get maybe a little bit more in depth, like trying to create a story together to really connect, to get immersed in this thing and play the game. And I guess that in essence might be the best place to go off of in terms of like deciding which group or which individuals might not be a good fit for the party. What is the GM's intention here? What are they trying to do? Because at the end of the day, they are the ones that are kind of making this story, making this world, doing this thing. And they'll also be the ones, I guess, that will decide like, hey, yeah, this is my desire and hope for this campaign.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good segue into the GM side of things. I think, you know, I'm not an experienced GM. The reality is that whenever I do run something, I very much as I possibly can, proposition players to have their own ideas. You know, it's one of those things where it's like, we'll get to a point where there's some sort of lull in what I have planned or like what is immediately happening. I'm like, all right, what do you guys do? And I ask them all the time. I'm like, all right, what are you doing? Like, because I'm not going to do it for you. Like, and you know, that probably doesn't vibe with some people. There's definitely going to be players out there that I will run into at some point in my playing time that I'm going to ask that question. They're going to look at me like a deer in headlights. Like, what do you want me to do? And it's like, no, wait, like, you know, that's not how I look at this. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm going to give you an outline and you make the decisions here. You ask me questions, you know,
it's a roadmap. You know what I mean?
I want interaction. There are some DMs that will gladly take the reins and just run you right down a railroad.
We call those GMs railroaders, because it's like you're on a train, you're on tracks, and you literally have only the one direction you can possibly go. And
sometimes there's a turn, but you always end up back where you started again.
Well, I mean, you know, and that I feel like, again, like, it's, in my opinion, railroading. I know a lot of people have a lot of strong feelings about it, and like for me, like, I absolutely believe that D&D, again, the majesty and the magic and the amazingness of D&D is the fact that it is very much predicated on player choice and autonomy, right? What are you choosing to do? You can think of and have almost anything that you can imagine or think of happen, you know, within reason, of course, to a certain extent. But like taking away player agency, as it is referred to as, is a very slippery slope. I'm not going to sit here and say that it is impossible to do it well, because sometimes you do have to take away player agency a little bit in order to, again, maybe establish a really nice narrative or plot hook or dynamic or like scene that can really enmesh and, again, immerse your players in it. Sometimes you have to be like, hey, like a player might be like, hey, we're running into this throne room in order to like attack, you know, the big bad evil guy. And the big bad evil guy kind of starts to monologue a little bit about like maybe something that's going on. He's giving a little bit more information. You have a player go like, I instantly attack him while he's monologuing. And it's like, you know, while you don't want to necessarily say like, well, no, your character's not going to attack him because he's just going to sit there and listen to him prattle on. Like, what you can maybe do, again, as a way of this is definitely something that helps establish... Yeah, well, sanctuary or just shield. You can just be like, there's a barrier, there's a wall of force between you and him.
Sphere. Like, there's so many.
There are
so
many
in-game
ways of being able to counteract a player's attempt to maybe, you know, because it's like they have that meta knowledge, right? They have that outside meta knowledge of like. And some players might not be as interested in again being more immersed and maybe understanding what's kind of happening, because that is kind of, I feel like, even in video games and movies and stuff where they do that, is like, I feel like the reason for why a person or a hero might allow like a villain to monologue if they're not like, you know, being tied up or restrained, is they do maybe want to try and understand a little bit on this person's motives and reasons for doing what they're doing. Because you can come to a better understanding. You can handle a situation or whatever much easier if you have a better understanding of the reasons or the aspects of why it's happening. And so like if a villain is monologuing and saying like, this is my plan, or even like, this is what I am doing, or whatever, it's like, not only does that provide like a cool moment for you as the GM to like, you know, flesh out your world, this BBEG to give him more of a personality and a face and life, you know, but it also gives you the ability to bring your players more into it. And I would hope that they would be receptive to that. But in the off chance that they're not, that they maybe want to try to, you know, they want to like, what's the word I'm looking for? Subvert expectation and, you know, like sneak attack the guy. It's like, one, just because the villain is monologuing, he sees them there. They're like, he's not gonna be surprised just because he's talking, and then, you know, you pull out an arrow and fire, or you cast a spell while he's talking. Well, it's like he sees you there. Like,
there's, you know, one of my DMs, it's very hard to get off an attack before an initiative round unless they can't.
That's what I was gonna say. Like, he sees you, you can roll initiative if you're going to attack.
Yeah, if you're gonna attack, like the moment you make yourself combat ready and they see you stepping forward with intention is when we roll initiative. And that's when it comes a battle of dexterity and like initiative in general. Now, I think there's time. What I will say is, as a, you know, if you're a DM and you have this problem where you bring up these, you know, you have a villain and there's backstory and there's a plan and they want to talk about it a little bit and give your party, you know, a couple drops of information, and your players are consistently interrupting that to attack them. If you don't want to do, like, if you don't want to have some in-game reason that they can't, whether it's magic, whether it's an item, whatever it is, whether they're not even there, it's like an image of the villain. If you don't want to do that because maybe this villain is supposed to be mundane, maybe this villain is supposed to be a martial person, just ask them to stop. Like, I know it sounds weird, but I mean, as a DM,
that is another option.
Like,
absolutely,
person to person, just ask them to stop.
That is absolutely another option. Yes, to just be like, I'm sorry.
I think it's reasonable. You know, they get to play their character. They get to come in and have this story and all these things that they get to do, and they get to role play the whole time. You should also get your role playing time. And
I 100% agree.
Now, don't take it so far that you're talking for 25 minutes, because no one wants to listen to you talk for 25 minutes.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I applaud you for writing all this wonderful story. I applaud you for putting all this time in. Nobody's going to listen to you for that long. It's just how it is, right?
At least not with them just talking at the party. It's like, if you want to have like a discourse or a conversation, like if the party starts to like respond and wants to get into a debate or a philosophical conversation, that's one thing, right? Because that shows that they are participating still. The party is still interacting. But as to Sam's point, no player necessarily wants to just have their GM essentially play with themselves, if you get my meaning. You know what I mean?
It's a little gross to do that in front of your friends. So
a little bit, you know, for at least depending on the time, you know, like maybe for like a couple of things, it can be fun and interesting to see for a moment. But after a certain amount of time has elapsed, you're like, okay, can I also play now? Can we play the game too?
Yeah.
But
just remember, don't play with yourself in front of your friends. It's it can get real weird.
Not for more than maybe like a minute or two, really. Like, you know what I mean? like couple of seconds. It can be, again, a funny, interesting little scene to view. But other than that, you know, you might be starting to push the line there.
Yeah. To me, that kind of that pushes into a type of GM that I personally can't stand. And it's something that is unfortunate.
Springboard off of that into some more archetypes of kind of problematic GMs, or aspects that GMs can maybe exhibit that are maybe problematic.
Yeah, I think there's two trees of GM that can come from a problem like this, one way or the other, which you've had experience with the domineering GM who will just push whatever they want to happen.
What
really gets under my skin, and I can't stand, is a GM with no push, no self-preservation. They're a complete pushover, doormat.
Okay.
Like, they just don't have,
they fold 100% any and all the parties,
or like they have no power of like keeping everything reined in. And I'm not saying they have to be, you know, in charge of everyone, but the reality is that if you just let people do whatever they want all the time, they're going to walk all over you. And unfortunately, in a scenario like D&D or a tabletop RPG, it is usually one GM and a group of players. In terms of just the amount of personalities on one side of the table versus the other, it can be difficult. I think, you know, a GM that doesn't know how to get their players to shut up for a second is, you need to have, like, as a person, you need to be assertive enough but not disrespectful.
You need to have some backbone.
Yeah,
you know, and you can be respectful, like Sam just said. You don't need to be an asshole in order to gain some amount of, like, you know, order or control, right? Like, you know, that's what they always order in the court, right? The judge is always like slams the gavel, because it's just, that is sometimes, like we said before, railroading, but railroading with a purpose and within reason, you know, because again, you're trying to have this moment and you're trying to enjoy yourself as well as have your players enjoy what's happening, you know. And like Sam said, we can also, I think, springboard off of this and to the other one, like Sam just said, like there's the really weak GM who has no control of anything, and then we'll just let players kind of go wild. That's where a lot of problematic players can come to, where they believe, like, there's no consequences. I can just do whatever I want. I can steal from my other party members. I can murder all these NPCs and this whole thing, and nothing will happen. That's a huge problem. On the other hand, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have the overbearing GM who literally won't let your players do anything ever without your okay. And you literally be like, no, you can't do that. Like I said, like, you know, you go into the same example. They go into the throne room, into the BBG. He starts monologuing and pontificating. And the player's like, I'm going to shoot him. He's like, no, you don't. You can't do that. You can't shoot him. Why not? Because I say you can't. And it's like, that's not the way to handle that. Like, you can't tell a player that they can't necessarily, like, do something, like, because that goes against the whole spirit and essence of the game. The point is, like, these characters that these players have, these are like the only beings in this universe that the GM has no real control over, unless it's like, you know, with magic that's dominating their mind for a bit or whatever. And even those magics are like, they are very short time. Like, they have a very short duration for a reason. Like, you in this game, it is about giving your players agency. And any abilities or any stuff that is used to take that agency away is, again, only used for a short time, because it's supposed to be a tool to help drive a narrative. It is supposed to be used for a purpose, and not for it to be a permanent fixture on, like, hey, I just have control of your character now. You just do everything that I say anyway. Because at that point, if you're just gonna make them do whatever you want without any real thought or consideration to what they want to do, then it's like, just play by yourself.
Yeah,
you just play by yourself. Write a book, write a novel, go play Baldur's Gate, go play Divinity, whatever, multitude of other games where you can do that. There's no reason to be doing this here.
Yeah.
And that being so I guess, and that culmination is like we're saying, like, for GMs out there, you got to find that decent balance. We get it. Confrontation is hard for GMs who maybe don't want to, like, get into conflict or don't want to say no to their players. It's okay to say no, so long as it's reasonable and how you say it. Again, if your player is literally saying like, "Oh, I want to like jump off of this guy's chest, do like a triple backflip, land in a splits, cut this dude at the knees, turn around, fire at that guy in the face, turn around, twist and kick that guy in the face and sweep kick this dude." It's like, okay, you can't really, within the confines of the game, how it works and how it's meant to be played, really allow that kind of stuff, like, unless they have some kind of like unless they have like, triple action surge or some shit like that.
It's like, I think you can temper expectations to what's available, but there's always flair. Let them have flair.
Exactly.
And if you know what,
if it's great,
if they get weird with it, if they go over the top, make them roll checks.
And if they fail, like,
make it sound funny. Like,
even with all of that, like, you can say like, hey, it'd be like, okay, you know what? We can't necessarily do all of that stuff, maybe like in one turn. But for instance, if you want to like try to like, flip kick off that guy, why don't you go ahead and like give me like an acrobatics check to see if you can like, use that guy as like a springboard, and you can do like, your triple backflip. Yeah, okay, let's see how that works. And, they rolled well enough. You don't necessarily have to make the DC super high if you don't want to. Like, I feel like that's another thing that GMs can do a lot, is that they always want to make things like, they want to make checks like really high for it. And they maybe even don't want to make it high, but sometimes I know that a lot of GMs fall into this habit of, instead of being like, skill checks and saves are specifically used to determine if a character succeeds or fails. Technically speaking, it is not supposed to be like a measure of how well a character does something, for instance. Like, just like, for instance, it's like, oh, hey, you want to roll an acrobatics check? Technically speaking, you would want to say, you would have to roll this number to succeed at what you are trying to attempt to do. It wouldn't be like, just roll a d20, add your acrobatics, and let's see how well you do it. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, it's like, okay, you rolled like a 10. Then it's like, oh, well, you failed the check. Or it's like, oh, well, you didn't really do it that great. It's like, depending on how you choose, like, technically speaking, it should be, you have a set number. If they reach that number or exceed it, they succeed at whatever they're trying to do.
Yeah, I know there's certain things where it can be different.
I think there's certain things where maybe it could be a scale, but
it's like, I want to draw a picture. Okay, well, roll a sleight of hand check for me. And if they roll like a 12, it's a pretty good picture. If they roll a 4, you look like you're drawing with finger paint. It's not good.
I agree.
But that's like, not meaningful to a vast majority of the game. Like, most things in the game, it's a pass-fail scenario.
It should be a pass-fail scenario.
It's like gym class in the 80s. It's a pass-fail. There is no grade. Like, it's just, you did well enough to succeed, or you unfortunately failed. And you
accomplished what you're trying to do. Like, the specific example I'm wanting to kind of give is, in my experience, is like, I had a GM at one point who, like, he seemed to have a real hard time, like, with insight checks. Like, he just didn't necessarily want to give us information about stuff. He was always like just so incredibly like restrictive or like tight-lipped and lidded on any information we wanted to try and get. And so when we would like try to like be like, okay, well, I insight check this character. It's like, okay, we'll roll an insight check for me. And it's like, okay, he wouldn't necessarily give us a DC or whatever. And it's like, he wouldn't necessarily ask us what we're trying to find out. It's like, we would even tell him, we'd be like, I'm trying to figure out if they're kind of like lying or whatever. And like, you give an insight check and it's like, they're like, well, you can't really tell. Like, you would roll like a 13 or so. A pretty decent check overall. You know what I mean? And it's like, it's probably still considered more middle ground average, but it's still at the higher end of that. And so it's like, he's like, well, you can't really tell from like their body language, like, cause like, insight doesn't, like, you can't read their mind. And it's like, well, no, but the point of insight is that you're able to discern from their body language, from their tone, from whatever else that they have said. Cause like, I even specifically a number of times, like, I would ask them questions to establish a baseline, right? I'd ask them very simple, easy questions they could answer like confidently, like obviously, like they're like, what's your name? Where do you live? Like, who's your partner or whatever, like, all that stuff. And then I would throw like a curveball in there to see what would happen.
Classic interrogation
techniques. Exactly. Very classic interrogation techniques. And then I would be like, okay, I want to do an insight check to see, like, because I was able to establish how he answers normally and then how he would answer.
Was there a difference that I could discern?
Yeah. And he would just like, and even with that background, I was like, he would be so like, just like, it was like pulling teeth to try and get like any extra information or to like do any extra things. And it's just like, why are you being so like restrictive and restraining with information? Like, and I believe we've talked about this a number of times. Like for me as a GM, I love to give my players information. I love it that I can like, just info bomb them on some stuff that they want to know. It's like, roll history, Yeah, your character has a background. Like, I want to use that. You guys made backgrounds and stuff. Like, your character would probably have at least have some knowledge about this kind of thing. Yeah. Roll me an insight check or roll me a history or roll me religion, whatever it is. Like, give your players the option. And yes, absolutely. To my GM's credit, insight is not
mind reading.
No. It does not allow you to know like their innermost deepest secrets and thoughts, but it can give you a little bit more, as the name literally says, insight into their mindset, maybe some of their motivations, whether or not they are telling you the truth. And that is where you can then prompt yourself to try and maybe like persuade them, intimidate, deceive, to get the truth out of them.
I think, the way I look at insight is because I think insight's a difficult skill for both GMs and players, in my opinion.
I mean, it's the concept itself is, Because
usually when you roll insight, it's a contested check. If they're lying, they'd roll deception. If they're not, your DM could also roll persuasion. The reality is that insight is supposed to be a measure of reaction from a character, but that character could be in like someone who looks suspicious but is genuinely telling the truth. But if you roll like a middling insight check and they roll a really good persuasion check, what the DM can give you from an insight check won't necessarily dissuade you from thinking that they're a suspicious person. Kind of the way I look at it is when people ask, can I make an insight check? I ask what they're looking for. They roll it. I do a roll behind the screen for whether or not they're lying, whether or not, like, if they're lying, I roll one thing. If they're not, I roll a different thing. And if they're being an open book, I don't roll at all. But the reality is like, there's only so much I can tell you. I can't just give you a life story.
Insight check. Like,
so like for me, it's always like, if the person's nervous, whether or not they're telling the truth, if you roll a good enough insight check, you're gonna know that they're nervous. You're gonna know, like, you'll see the twitching in the sweating or being uncomfortable.
You can even say like, again, like, hey, if they're nervous, but they're maybe nervous about like they want you to believe them, like there's
so many reasons to be nervous.
Yeah, it's like they are nervous because they're scared and they want you to believe what they're saying. They're not necessarily trying to deceive you. Like, you can even say like, you don't get any malicious or manipulative intent out of this.
No, I mean,
you
there's
get a genuineness in this, like, and that's how you can like kind of, I guess, clear like the suspicion aspect about being like, you don't, because again, I also view insight, for instance, like intuition, right? Yeah. Where it's just like, it can be in essence almost like a divine like sense. Again, your characters are, how I always like to view player characters in any campaign is like, all the players at the table are like visiting gods to the GM's world, right? The GM is the overgod of this world. All the players are visiting gods, and the player characters are literally the player avatar. Like they're like they are. That's why the GM does not have control over these characters right now, because they are the avatars of these visiting gods, and therefore these avatars have special abilities, powers, attributes, and things attributed to them that make them special right now. And so therefore, insight, I feel like, is a perfect example. Insight can give you almost a divine or sixth sense intuition about a creature or a situation where you're just like, the hair on the back of your neck is prickling up. You know something is off. You can't necessarily get more specific information, but you get this sense where you're like, hey, this can help clarify a situation a little bit for you, at least the nature of it. It won't necessarily tell you the specifics or what you're necessarily trying to do, because that's going to require a little bit more investigation, a little bit more effort, or something in some other way. But this can at least clarify from almost like a metaphysical, ironically, position on like, hey, this is kind of the vibe going on here.
Yeah, and I think, for DMs who are maybe a little bit unsure as to how to play that in a way that, lets their players know for sure that there's something they're either missing or something that they're not. I think there's so many different ways to word interaction, especially with things like insight or persuasion or just ways to word interactions with other characters and what people could notice. So many different tells. There's different ways to establish certain feelings. If you're not maybe the best role player, say you don't do voices that great, or you're bad at changing your inflection, an insight check could give you like, you notice that they stumbled on a couple of their words, or they don't seem focused on the conversation that you're having. They might be thinking about something else. There's so many different ways to be like, well, there might be something, there might be something going on here. You're not quite sure what it is, but there's definitely something up. And it's like, that's enough. That's enough information, I think, for most reasonable human beings that you can infer from kind of the tone of what you're going to put forward, whether this is a bad thing, whether it's kind of more of a neutral thing, or whether it's literal, just unfortunate innocence. There's a reason polygraph tests are not really admitted in court anymore.
No.
It's because they're not real.
No, they're not.
They don't actually work off.
It's not a lie detector.
They work off of things like heart rate,
perspiration, how a person, again, like if they're like moving, if they're jittery, again, nervous. You can be nervous because you're in a rather threatening, kind of like intense situation. That doesn't mean that you're lying.
Yeah, like, anxiety is a very real emotion, but from a lot of different people and a lot of different levels. And if you, a group of magically endowed superheroes, ostensibly, walk into a tavern in a small town and interrogate the desk guy, they're going to be nervous. You could kill the entire inn.
Especially since, death is not an uncommon occurrence in most of these, environments and campaigns. It's like,
I would argue, unless you're talking to guard captains and prison wardens and very important people, even some of them are probably not going to be super comfortable.
Be wary, I would say, yeah.
Unless you're talking to a bunch of experienced veterans of combat and death and magical bullshit, you're not normal most of the time, unless you're starting out like level 2 or level 1 and you genuinely are just higher than a peasant. They're gonna look at you with some opinion, and I think players are gonna, that's actually, I do want to use this, so just keep that in mind, that you're not always gonna get 100%, and I don't think you should, from an insight check. And DMs, like, don't just wall off anything, even if they don't make a great insight check. Give them something, even if it's inconsequential, because the reality is like, be like, hey, make an insight check. They roll like an 8. Okay, well, they obviously didn't get the information they're looking for. Give them some other bullshit that they would notice, because it's fun. Well, it doesn't help them.
It's fun, or even just be like, you can also change the DC difficulty on who they're trying to incite, right? Yeah. If this person is like a much more boisterous, kind of like thoughtless, or much more like, cantankerous individual, he probably isn't really going to be trying to hold much things close to the chest, right? He's going to be very open. He's going to be like, yeah, ha ha ha, yes, yeah. His emotions will probably be much easier to decipher than many others in a lot of ways. And you don't need to roll a high one. And, it will even specifically can use this as another great springboard to one of the specific topics that Sam also wanted to discuss today, is a bit of an effect that other mediums can kind of have on the game as a whole, because that's obviously does have maybe an effect of expectations of new players coming into the game, and can lead to a number of these, more maybe problematic behaviors that we've been talking about. Specifically, most recently, Baldur's Gate 3. Yeah. But this particular situation, I feel like, could actually be, ironically, a good aspect of Baldur's Gate 3 to incorporate in games, such as in the game, there are a number of, obviously, as people have played, skill checks and stuff all throughout it, just like in Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop. I have noticed, however, like much contrary to my actual experience with tabletop D&D, that in the game of Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of the DC checks, especially at the beginning and like in Act 1, are really freaking low. Like there are some that are like DC 7 or DC 5 or 2. Usually it's only like the very specific thing for like a 2, but it's still like that when I saw those numbers, that immediately just that was crazy to me. I'm like, what? A DC 5 check? That's
it's
insane.
Funny. It's one of those
I've only ever heard like a DC 10 being like the lowest in most tabletop games, at least that I've played.
It's
like,
well, if you go over the actual DC chart
rules,
in 5e, there is a DC 5.
There is.
And obviously you can put any number in there, but it's supposed to be kind of like a, hey, this is easy, this is not so easy,
this is
intermediate,
like, and then 30 being like godlike success.
And that's like that is something I will say I did enjoy about Baldur's Gate.
Yeah,
is that you'll run around in Act 1 and like, well, I'm not going to spoil anything, but like you'll have lots of low to intermediate DCs. There are going to be a couple that are up there, and it's for things that you would expect. Some sort of vault door, that's going to be a higher DC. Trying to convince somebody of something that they have no interest in, that's a high DC. Like stuff like that. And then randomly, you'll have like DC 30. There'll be like one big thing that's like a DC 30, and most of the time there's another way to get around it, maybe. But like there are some very high checks in the game that come out of nowhere, and you're like, wait a minute, but when you actually compare that to real D&D, that's not out of the ordinary.
No.
In fact, like, I'll give an example. In one of my campaigns, my character found a infernal puzzle cube. If you aren't familiar with those, they'll usually have some really nice information inside of them, whether it's the true name of devils, whether it's
it's gonna be something pretty juicy. Something pretty juicy.
Rules as written for a infernal puzzle cube, you need a DC 30 intelligence check to open it, because it's an ever-changing puzzle, and when you fail, it hurts you real bad.
That's the whole point of it.
But the reality, because the thing is like, if you know the cube, I believe that there's ways to get around that DC. But
if you know normal, like the code or whatever.
For a normal person, it's very difficult. For an infernal, I think it's different. But the reality being is like, what Baldur's Gate does is they don't put any 100% you have to do this to complete the game behind a DC 30 check. There isn't one.
Nothing is locked out of a check.
There are options that you will take that then maybe make things more difficult. But the reality is, most of the things that have a high check in that game are completely avoidable. If you don't want to go
avoidable or even obtainable, just going a different route,
in a different route
or manner of approaching it.
And I think that's
huge.
A huge part of that game.
We were talking about that in the last episode with GMs on like, providing more avenues or pathways for success rather than just the one, especially if you're going to try and lock it behind a skill check wall. You know what I mean? Like that is one of the biggest no-nos, is like, you can't just be like, hey, you can't go this way anymore because you failed a skill check, and this whole thing now is just blocked off or gone.
Well, it's like one of my favorite things is in that game, for the most part, pretty much any locked door has a key. There is no locked door that doesn't have a key. Now,
it has multiple keys sometimes.
There are a couple, like, obviously magical things that it's a little bit different. There's puzzles or whatever, but if you want to get into a locked room, there is some way to get a key, whether it's hidden somewhere and needs a perception check to find,
whether it's take it off of the body of a take person it off of nearby.
There are so many parts of that game where the key is just sitting on a table somewhere, and it's not even thievery to take it.
No,
and it's funny because in the way we look at D&D, it's a little bit different than that, because I think the reality is that most people, when they write a story for D&D, it's hard to think of all those things. There's a reason why a lot of people who talk about what a DM's playstyle could benefit from is not writing everything out right at the beginning and having more of like a on the
like a middling road where you you write out maybe some of the more important stuff, like the encounters, kind of important to maybe write those out a little bit, So you have an idea of like,
how hard you want things to be,
how hard you want things to be, or how, how hard hitting your monster is going to be against the party, whatever. But then maybe, and then maybe some more the background of like, the world, an area or whatever that the party is in. So you just have like a little bit of an idea of like, hey, what are there's a tavern, there's an inn, there's a bank, there's a whatever, and these are the NPCs that would just likely be there, right?
Well, it's like it's one of those things where like, say you walk into a jail.
You're gonna have
it's an old jail, like you're trying to find, like it's a ruin, and there's a jail, and there's like dead bodies.
There will probably be a ring of keys, maybe just hanging on.
If you walk in and they walk up to a jail cell, and there's something inside the jail cell that they want, and they don't have a way to get it out without opening the door, and they can't figure it's locked, and they don't have a rogue, or they're not rolling well enough to open it. And one of your players goes, "Shouldn't there be like a set of keys?"
Yeah, are there keys anywhere?
You know what? Realistically. Yes, there should.
You know what? They could even just say like, they fail. They'll just be like, is there any other way we can get in here? And then that can also just be the GM, like be like, doop, all right, roll me a perception or investigation check.
Yeah.
And here is again where if you do want to still give them that sense of accomplishment, right? And that's also again what I feel like with Baldur's Gate and the low DCs, give it a low DC. It's so low that it's almost impossible for them to fail. Like, unless they all somehow roll like nat ones. And even then,
nat one does not mean you fail, which is something that I
automatically mean that you fail a check. Okay. Yeah. If their bonus still gets them above a 5, they can get the thing,
That's something I do. That's something I don't like about Baldur's Gate. Is that expectation of failure.
I agree. Because I also feel like like there is like, for instance, like that with Baldur's Gate, the fact that it's like, oh, you got a critical miss. It's like, why? Why should, like, especially in combat where you're fighting, because it's just like
I'm okay with critical miss for an attack.
You rolled a 1, but the problem being though is it's just like that, like nothing else happens, right? When you roll a 1. It's just literally telling you, hey, you rolled a 1. Because it's like, for instance, I like in combat where like if you have a thing like critical hits, you get some extra bonus damage. You can do like, double damage. It's great. You always hit on a critical hit. That's awesome. In the actual TTRPG version, I'm like, if that's the case, nat 1s for attack rolls, I think there should be some other complications, like mostly something light, like, oh, you end up accidentally falling prone, or you're flat-footed, or like, oh, like I don't think like, oh, your sword broke. That's stupid.
No,
you shouldn't do stuff like that. Maybe you'd be like, oh, like, yeah, your sword got knocked away or something like that, or like, oh, you accidentally, if you're firing at somebody, it's like, hey, maybe you have a chance of hitting somebody, your friend, close to them, because that's a thing that happens all the time in real life too. It's like if you're gonna shoot at a moving target with an ally like close, like fighting them, you have a chance of hitting them too. Yeah. But
the thing that we always did, critical miss was a miss. Like if you roll the 1, you roll the 1. And the reason it was so like, is because it's just as likely to happen as rolling a 20. It's 2 ends of the probability spectrum of like, oh yay and oh no.
Yeah.
The reality was, I think we had talked about doing a critical failure table for attacks. For melee, it was too much of it was detrimental to just playing the game.
That's what I'm saying. I don't like critical tables. I don't like tables.
The reality was for us is that we all agreed that ranged critical fails would have a chance to hit things if they were like, if you were shooting next to someone. The reason I like to kind of justify it with is that when you're fighting at range, the advantage is that nobody's hitting you in your face. So maybe the disadvantage is that if someone's firing something behind you, you could get hit by it.
Yeah.
We don't have any of them for melee. I think just missing is fine. If you want to make it hard on your players, and if you do it to your players, do it to your monsters. The reality being, if you want to do that, that's fine. Make sure everybody's cool with that, or make it known at the beginning of your game.
Yep.
But the reality is, now with people, I think start like with Baldur's Gate, the craze it has been, and so many people being like, oh my god, this is game of the year. There's going to be people who have played that who now want to try D&D, and I think it's something to remember is that a critical fail or a critical success is not always that.
It doesn't automatically mean that you succeed or fail completely.
No, in like attack rolls, most of the time, I think over most tables, a nat 20 is always going to hit and a natural 1 is always going to miss. And with attacks, I'm okay with that.
Agreed.
The reality is that there is no critical fail or critical success on skill checks and saving throws. It just it doesn't exist in the actual rules of 5e. I'm sure there are variant rules that could change that, but the reality is that if you roll a 1 on a skill check, but you have a plus 15, that's a 16, baby. And if that's enough to succeed, that succeeds. There is no automatic failure. And if you roll a natural 20, but you only have a plus 2, and you needed a 25, you fail. Like, it's just, you know, and like some people try to argue
just
this,
are not skillful
you're not good
enough to do this thing.
Yeah, you rolled the best you could possibly roll, and you still came up short. That happens in life. Not everyone can be good at everything all the time, and so the reality,
even if you're good, you're just maybe not good enough for this particular thing. You are still incredible. A 22 is amazing,
but maybe not. Maybe this isn't your scale of choice.
Or this thing was just so powerful, or so whatever. That's the point of it. It's not supposed to be able to just be unlocked with the skill of whatever. Like, unless you are like a godly skillful person, it's like, and that's okay. It's all right, and it's like, you know,
and I think that's something that, you know, they tried to make it D&D-esque in the critical fail, critical success thing, and I understand why they did it the way they did it. It's fun. It creates a sense of like I
said, like I don't like.
There's definitely like an issue with it when you're trying to translate that back to D&D, which you know,
like
they said they're like, we base it off of this, but now everything's the same.
Yeah, and there are. I mean, heck, they base Divinity even off of D&D. Like, so many games have based a ton of their like mechanics or the foundation of how they approach all this stuff off of D&D. Like, D&D has been around for a long time, and it is the precursor to a lot of video games and a lot of other things, like, you know, turn-based combat and all that stuff. Obviously, D&D is based off of another game even prior to that too, that did all this stuff first anyway. But either way, point being is like Baldur's Gate 3, there are a lot of aspects about it that are amazing, that are great, and that, again, I think are positives that maybe a lot of people should adopt into their game. Like, again, I think a positive is have low DCs for checks. You don't always have to make a DC like a 10 or 15 to succeed, right? Like, they don't always have to be like so amazing that they succeeded at this check. You can make it more average. Make it like, yeah, it's a 5 or it's a 7, you know? And it's like, that still gives them, especially if they like, if they're rolling low, and it's like, if this is information or something that's like, you know, this isn't that super hard. Because I feel like people disconnect how good it is to roll like a 16 or higher. Like, you're considered like, that is really freaking good to do
consistently do that.
Like that, and not even consistently, even to do that at all. It's like, again, when you, like Sam referenced, with the actual table that the book tells you on like the DC levels on like what it's considered to be, right? Like 5 is considered to be like, oh, that's easy, you know. 10, like 10 is like considered to be like, oh, you know, that's decently easy, you know what I mean, or fairly easy. It's a bit, maybe a bit more, requires a bit more finesse. 15 and up is like, that's a hard check. Like 15 or higher is normally like a hard, like 15 to 20 is a hard check. Like 20 to 25, that's like, oh my God, like that's like master. That's like masterfully done. Like anything on 20 or above, masterfully done. Anything like, you know, 25 to 30 or whatever, like that's like, that's you're starting to get into like levels of demigod status, and then 30 and up is god level. You know what I mean?
For context, this is the typical DC's table. Very easy is 5, easy is 10, moderate is 15, hard is 20, very hard is 25, and nearly impossible is 30. Now, that's, you know, the whole point is like, oh, you want a very easy task? Most people can do it, unless circumstances are unusual or weird, you know. And most of the time, you should just let a character succeed on that without even asking for a DC. They say this, but
it's like, hey, hey, you like to roll dice? Okay, here you go.
Dice.
Give them a DC 5 check, especially take into consideration their background, right? Because again, you also can be like, okay, would this be very easy for someone like them, right? Do they have a lot of background or a lot of skill or a lot of experience in this area? Then that can be like, you know what? This would probably be pretty easy for them. I'm going to give them like a DC 7 or DC 8 check. in order for them to like, recall this information or accomplish this task. This isn't supposed to be difficult, especially if it's something that can help move your narrative along or enmesh your players more in the game. Take that aspect. Use lower DCs and use higher DCs only when it's like truly, again, appropriate for like a moment, right? Like if you do something like, oh yeah, this thing, like Sam said, with that freaking infernal puzzle box, that thing is designed to be so difficult to escape or to figure out for a reason. It usually contains information or something that is incredibly valuable. All kinds of vaults, any kind of whatever should have a DC, like a super high DC, because that's the point of it. That is the point of that object or that thing, to be impenetrable, impregnable, all that stuff. But it's like, if you're just trying to find a way inside of this, like this ruined prison cell, the hinges are probably all rusted and frayed. Like, you can give a strength check of like an 8 to like a barbarian to like pull the hinges off that thing. If he has like a strength of 18 or 20, like that shouldn't be that difficult. Or like, he feels super strong now. He feels cool. Yeah, he just ripped that thing off its hinges. That's great.
I think similar to the scaling DCs that they did throughout that game, where the further you get in, the harder the DCs generally are. I think
you get better, so it's like
that's kind of the point. I think something could also be said for the way that they scale difficulty in general. Just for context, if those of you who haven't finished it or played it at all or are interested, it is a 3-act game. There's 3 distinct acts. Now, there are a variety of areas that you get to go in, but each area in and of itself, even sections of the maps, have, in my opinion, their own difficulty classes. So,
absolutely.
The game points you in a direction with the idea that the further you go in, the more difficult it gets. But you can wander into things that are more difficult than what you should be wandering into, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah. Think of it almost like an MMO where you have various areas where they have level caps, right? Yeah. They have various level areas, right? It's very similar kind of aspect here. Only obviously it's not an MMO, so it's not as clear usually.
No, and it's more of like an inferred difficulty than anything else.
Yeah, overall.
The reality is, I think in normal D&D, if you have like a starting town, like I'll put it this way. A skill check in a bar versus a skill check in the guardhouse are 2 different difficulty classes.
Yeah, they're 2 different tiers.
Breaking a lockbox at a store, like opening a lockbox at a store and picking, an evidence chest in a dungeon, one of those things is going to have higher security than the other. And there's context clues to that. And I think as a DM, if you don't have it like maybe in your head what every single check is going to be, because God willing, I don't ever. That's not how I DM.
No, man.
Sorry.
No.
I look at a situation and I think, how hard is this supposed to be?
Yeah, how hard should this really be?
And then I go on my whim. And sometimes I mess up. That's okay. Sometimes you mess up and then someone rolls like 2 under it. Sometimes you'll be like, oh, DC 18, but you don't tell them that because you never tell the DC.
You probably shouldn't unless you like want to make it again like really intense and like down to the wire. I think it's okay to say the DC sometimes.
I'd rather they don't know, because then it's always intense.
No, because it also, but it's intense because it's like, if it's like, this is like down to the wire, right?
That's true.
It's like, okay, I have to succeed this check or something's gonna happen. It can make it feel even more intense when you're like, all right, well, you got to roll this number. You know what it is, because in the back of your mind, if the GM doesn't tell you, like you could roll whatever, and you can just be like, is that enough? And the GM can just retroactively decide, which in my opinion I think that's a good thing.
That's why I like
it. I think that's a good thing to do most of the time, but I also think that it is I think it is important at times to be like, okay, this because that makes them feel even more like they really accomplished something, right? When you're like, it's a 15, that is what this is. You want to do this, it is a 15. You know this, you have to roll that. If you fail, then there's nothing I can do. If you take it, the GM again bequeaths that to you, like this is just truly the luck of the dice right now. Okay.
Yeah.
This isn't me influencing or maybe retroactively, whatever. Like, this is what's happening. And so sometimes that can be really great. But I feel like a lot of the time I agree with Sam in that most of the time, I would say GMs don't say what the DC is, because again, I like to roll dice. I do. I like to make checks. I like to do that, but obviously all within reason. Like Sam said, it's like, hey, if they're trying to like pick a lock inside, like just a peasant's house, right, or commoner's house, it's not high security. They're not a noble. They don't have any whatever. It's like, okay, yeah, roll a check. It's like make it a 15, make it a 5, make it a 7. Don't tell them. Just say like roll a check. No. And
it also depends on where your characters are at. If this character, if you're level 10 and it's a rogue and they're really good at picking locks, this is what they do. They could do this in their sleep with their eyes closed, with one hand, with one hand and one foot behind their back. Like, the reality is that God forbid, like a weird freak occurrence happens, they're gonna just slide a pick in there, go like this, and it pops open if it's an easy lock. So why have them roll? Now, if it's a tense situation, if they're actively trying to quickly pick this lock while there's something fucking running at them from behind them,
and maybe they're liable to make a mistake because of
have them roll, because the reality is they have a plus 15. But if they roll a 1, maybe they're freaking out. Maybe their pick breaks.
That's what I'm saying.
A small chance in a large field of play where you're like, well, in any other circumstance, you wouldn't have to roll this. But because you made a decision 5 minutes ago,
tension.
There's consequences. And
there's consequences, and it creates tension.
There's something to be said. Like, that's kind of, one of those things I liked about the game, which some of my friends who haven't played these kinds of games before, they've never played a Larian Studios game, you can walk into mistakes and party wipes pretty easily at the beginning of the game because you're not meant to go there yet. But you still could. If you want to be real strategic and figure out real weird ways to do things, you can get around it.
Yeah, you can.
And I think that's a mirror to D&D in a good way, because
it is. It's based off the building blocks.
Say you're playing, I'm gonna throw out a few modules. If you haven't heard, I talked about some of these before. Waterdeep Dragon Heist, Tomb of Annihilation, Curse of Strahd. These are 3 sandbox heavy adventures that you can stumble in to a lot of terrible things at the very beginning.
Yeah, and if you're not ready for them.
And the reality is that they're meant to be played as a sandbox. It says in the module, if you're the DM, it literally says, don't keep your players from going to these places.
Yeah, they're going to go there. They're going to go there.
They have the agency to make that mistake. And that's that's the Death House in Curse of Strahd is a great example of, oh boy, and you'll have party wives. There's a reason why, at least for 2 of these, which is Tomb of Annihilation and Curse of Strahd, it literally recommends that the DM tells the players to have more than one backup character ready, because they will die. And not everybody likes that kind of game, but I think in reality, in D&D, I think more tables would benefit from the idea that there are things you can stumble into that are detrimental to yourself. Not everything is a storybook. And
I agree.
Now, if you as a DM, you don't want that for your game, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with wanting to tell a large story where you know that things are going to happen and you have these things planned out. And you don't want them to walk into something and ruin it and everything sucks and they just die. Because that can be heartbreaking from both ends of the table.
It can be traumatizing in some cases.
It can.
It's like,
if you're me, most of the time it's fine except for the one time. But
and then it's not actually fine.
The reality is that there's a balance there, I think, and it's something that we've talked about many times, where it's a respect thing. If you mess up, player or DM, if you mess up and you're like, shit, like this was not how this
I was like that.
That's okay. I
didn't like that.
Dude, I've had these are people I've been playing with for almost 6 years now, where we're pretty confident in each other not making those kinds of mistakes, and sometimes it still happens anyway, and we have to just kind of
that's just
let's just roll it back. Can we just roll it back?
It's like, can we maybe just retcon, and again, we're gonna maybe throw out like a super spicy hot take here, be okay with some retcons, people.
It's okay.
It's okay.
It's like save scumming.
It is. I save scum the heck out of Baldur's Gate 3 because like mostly because I just want to experience like as much of the game as possible. Like I save scum even just to be like, what are all the different dialogue options? Like,
I do that all the time.
Yeah, like I just like to go through like all the different to see like
which one of these is gonna piss off Lae'zel?
Yeah,
that one. I'm not gonna
click
that
one. Which one is gonna do this kind of thing? Like, what is your response? Because I just again, they made this game. It was so like incredibly like multi-layered. I'm like, I want to see as much of it as I can. I just like to do that stuff. But either way, point being is, and I know a lot of people again have like with save scumming, a lot of people have a lot of animosity and feelings about like retconning, you know, and it's like, you guys, it's about having fun. It's about and I get it. Don't get me wrong. I understand. I also do believe in like, you know, actions having consequences.
Yeah.
Right. And not necessarily just being like, oh, because obviously you can make the arguments like, well, if that just happens, then nothing actually matters, and your players can just do whatever they want, and they can just come back to life, or a Deus Ex Machina moment.
Yeah, that's not really what we're talking about.
And it's like, no, that's not what we're saying. Okay, it's about what is really going to be the best decision for your campaign and for your players to have fun. What is the best decision for everybody to have fun? Okay, not about just like. Not ever making sure that there aren't any consequences or not ever making sure there aren't any losses or whatever. But it's like, hey, to Sam's point, have a game where, players go, they die. Okay. Maybe don't have that be the end. Like, again, if those players still love those characters and want to play those characters, literally in Curse of Strahd, there's this whole thing about when you die, you don't necessarily die. There are some choices or decisions that you can make when your character dies that can bring your character back, but there are maybe consequences to choosing to go that route. Now, there are, again, GMs do a similar thing, but you don't necessarily have to make it as dark as Curse of Strahd does. You can make it where it's just like, hey, something benevolent maybe comes to offer aid or something in some way.
There's so many ways that you could be like, you owe me one. Like,
ways. And not even just that, though, but like, for instance, like what I also love about Baldur's Gate 3 that I think a lot more tables should implement is the fact that such powerful, like cosmic, the gods are active. They are real. They participate in the world actively. Like you see so many different beings that are either like demigods or actual gods or god adjacent that you encounter and interact with throughout the game. And it's like these creatures exist, and it's not just the bad ones that are always around and doing stuff.
Some of them are trying to help you.
Make the good one, the prominent good ones show up to help. That's okay. That is literally part of D&D as a whole. They do that all the time in any of their stories and anything else. It's like, do that more.
I would understand. I know some people are uncomfortable with the super high fantasy aspects of D&D. It's hard to grasp. It's hard to keep in, it's hard to keep in front of you and understand what you're doing. Like you'll miss things and stuff like that. I think, something about the retconning and giving people those options. There's something to be said. I have an example of what I don't want to be retconned. My first ever TPK. It was in the Waterdeep was it Horde of the Dragon Queen, Tyranny of Dragons, that series of modules.
Yeah.
And it was at Zolnthal's Tower, which is a decently difficult, well, actually, it's a difficult dungeon. It is a difficult spike in the game. You have to go there for the story, and it is trapped to high hell. And there is no way to figure out what to do without engaging some way. So there's always going to be some sort of exchange, whether that's because you're going to get hit, whether there's some sort of fight, you're going to lose some sort of resource. And when we played through this as the first team we played through, we got our asses beat getting into the tower in the first place. We were down resources, we were down health, we were, but we kept pushing on. Now, the retcon would, this isn't a retcon. We died. We should have died. We should have died very quickly, and we did. And it was one of those things where some of us, I got mad because I don't think
what could you have done?
For me, at first I was like this should not have gone down that way. And to be fair, I think all of us made mistakes that day. Mm-hmm. And you know, there were certain things I think you could point to more than others, maybe, but it doesn't matter. The reality is that as a group, we all made different mistakes in consequential, like in order to get where we wanted to get. I think a retcon isn't that. It's not taking that away, because we also chose to continue pushing on. If we felt like we were going to die, we should have left. And I think we learned that, you know, the hard way, unfortunately. But the reality is there are retcons. There are things where it's like, I want to figure out like a decent example. Okay, here's one. You're climbing up a mountain and one player rolls poorly and falls
and pulls everybody else down.
No, they're not tied together. Okay. But the rest of the party's immediate reaction is to attempt to save them. Mm-hmm. And you have 4 people at the table, and the next 3 rolls all suck.
They're just terrible.
And every single person falls off the side of that mountain and dies. That is 4 bad rolls in a row with the intention of saving someone.
Yeah.
Who they only thought one person was going to make a bad, you know what I mean? Like it was preventable for the fact that one, the DM maybe shouldn't have let that happen the way it did.
Make it. You don't have to make the check high. Like that's another.
No, and that's the reality is like if you have 4 people all roll a dice and they all roll 1, like that's so ridiculously outside of reality that it's like, you know, fuck it. Like, we're not doing this.
Like that,
I'm sorry.
I mean, that's again, it's just like because obviously some might make the argument that's like, oh well, if everybody rolled a 1, then like the gods just wanted you guys to die or whatever.
But the thing is like you're not dying for a story beat. There's no real
it's not being done for a reason.
There was no reason to make the check. It wasn't especially difficult. Do you have climbing gear? Well, guess what? You don't have to roll. Like again, it's one of those things.
I've had a thing, even if you have climbing stuff, it's like, oh yeah, you just make the check with advantage, and you're like, well,
no, the DC should be lower. But the reality is that I think DMs will fall into this mistake where they think everything needs a skill check, and if you fail, it is dire in every circumstance, and that's not true.
I mean, that's how I'm feeling. Like, believe me, like that exact scenario happened literally to my character too in this one campaign, where it's just like, it's just like you don't like. For instance, if you are climbing, let's say you're climbing a cliff, right? Make it almost like a 3-tier kind of thing, right? They roll a check, like Sam said, one of them rolled low, right? And they begin to kind of like their foot slips as they kind of like get a little bit off balance, and they're kind of like, you know, sliding down the slope a bit, right? You don't have to make it that they completely fell off the entire cliff and now they're just in free fall, like not being able to grab onto anything, you know? If it's like, okay, they fell down a bit, it's like, all right, really quickly, roll me another check really quick. To be like, all right, I'll roll another one. And again, because there's another issue with being, it's like, oh, if they have poor strength, for instance, you know, if they have like a -1 to strength, it's like, or athletics, whatever, it's like, what do you expect to happen right now if you're asking them to roll a check to do this thing here? Like, what do you expect is going to happen? Once again, these guys are above just your average Joe in terms of ability, capacity, or whatever. Climbing a cliff like this, it's not necessarily easy, but at the same token, it's like, hey, if they have tools, if they have other things that they can utilize or help, like, you know, you don't have to make it where you're gonna literally just have them die climbing a cliff. Well, that's like, really, is that really like how you want this to go?
No, and like that's kind of what I mean is like you can have them make skill checks, you can have them do that stuff, but it shouldn't, like, not every instance in your game should be life and death, and that's, I think DMs forget,
or even like
there are mundane aspects of life you can screw up on and recover from. It just takes time or more effort. It's not immediately you're either surviving and thriving or you're dead in a ditch somewhere. That's not how the world is.
Or it certainly doesn't have to be. And again, even with the understanding that this world is, you know, more dangerous than the real one in terms of, like, you know, there are monsters, there's evil things, demons, devils, all that stuff. Like, yes, absolutely. There are a lot more aspects and a lot higher opportunity to be engaging in life or death stuff. Absolutely. But you also have magic. You also have incredible feats of astronomical strength and ability or whatever. And not just that, but it's also like this is not like putting progress locked behind a skill check wall. It's like, oh yeah, you can't climb up that cliff to get to the spot that you need in order to stop the ancient ritual that's being conducted or whatever. It's like, oh, you failed the check to climb up there. And it's like, well, what are we gonna do?
How did those guys get up there? Because there must be a path.
Yeah, there must be some way. It's like, well, you got to go around now. It's going to take forever, and you're going to miss out on the ritual or whatever. And it's like, okay, that brings up the question. Then
the reality is with something like that, I should have gotten there with enough time to use the path, and what would have given me now an advantage to catch them before was to climb.
Exactly.
There's the whole concept shouldn't be you have to climb here or the other way is detrimental to the timeline. It should be I get there
timeline or even just the encounter. It's like you made that encounter. You wanted us we wanted to go there. Why are you making it now impossible for us to do this thing if you want us to do this specific way to? It's like that's not how this should work.
It should be flipped around.
That's you should get like Sam said, it should be if you're going to do this potentially risky or difficult thing, it should be something that gives you an extra bonus advantage or positive attribute that you wouldn't necessarily have had going the route that is just straight to them, or maybe even maybe a little bit more whatever. It's like you can't just make it where it's like this encounter is not possible to happen, or you're not going to be able to do this thing unless you do it this way. It's like that's just like why?
No, it should be,
and you're taking up more time in the session by having us waste time on this mundane thing. It's like this isn't fun. This isn't interesting. You're not allowing us to even try. This is just boring. What are we doing right now?
It should have been the opposite. It should be, well, you got here, a ritual is going to happen in a day or so. Now, if you take this long way around, you think it's going to take about that time. You'll get there in time to stop the ritual, but it's going to be close. That's okay. But if you're like, well, we have the ability, whether it's through gear or magic, or whatever, we could just go up that cliff face. That would take way less time. Well, now you get there and they're not prepared for the ritual.
Yeah, exactly.
Not only are they going to they're going to try to be fighting you and also be doing the ritual. They're going to have to split their forces.
Mm-hmm.
That's automatically an advantage towards the players for coming up with something that is different from the previously planned route.
Or at the very least, doing something that maybe was a little bit more perilous, a little bit more difficult, and not nearly as convenient or just easy.
There's an advantage there on time. I think it's something that I'm playing through a game right now where there are timetables for things. It's like, hey, you have this in 2 weeks. Just remember that you have 2 weeks to do whatever you want to do before you have to get to this meeting or whatever.
And now, if they run out of if they use up those 2 weeks by their own choice and prerogative,
that's their own choice.
That's something different. But if you're there, if they are doing everything they possibly can to actually get to this situation, to go down the encounter, the rabbit hole you set for them,
it's like if you
give them the tools to do so.
It's like if you tell your party you have 2 weeks before you have this thing, but the only other options of major activities you give them, one takes 10 days and the other takes 8. So you're like, okay, either you do one activity and you waste 4 days, or you do one activity and you waste 6, or you do both and you don't go to this thing. No, it should be one activity is 4 days, one activity is 6 days, and if something bad happens and it takes longer, then you have a risk. So maybe always in your back pocket, have an idea on how to get back here quickly. It's time management. You're not setting them up to fail. You're setting them up to make a bad decision fail.
You make choices. You give them options. You give them reasons of being like, hey,
oh my God, it's so frustrating.
It's so frustrating, Sam.
As a player,
it's just like
if you get put on a timetable or your DM tells you, no, this is the important thing, but then does everything in their power to either not let you do it or give you put restrictions on you against it. It's like, wait, but you wanted me to do this.
What's even worse is if there actually isn't even a timetable. It's just like, yeah, that thing's just up there now. And it's like, okay, so what? We're going to literally spend an entire session just trying to climb up this cliff to get there because there's no other way for us to go. And we're just going to do this instead of just getting to the actual thing that we want to do. This is the session. Because we're just rolling crap for whatever reason. We're rolling badly. We don't have a high bonus in this particular skill, and there's no other way for us. Really, this is what we're doing. This is what you're choosing to do.
I think things that if you want to keep players from getting to something easily, it should be things like puzzles. It shouldn't be just like that's a mountain. Like,
yeah,
why? Like, so I mean, honestly,
at least it's something engaging. It's not just a matter of like I roll, oh I succeed, or I fail. Oh I roll, I fail.
There
Oh,
should
I roll,
be something
I fail.
else.
Oh, I
there should
succeed.
be
I did something.
There should be another reasonable avenue, or it should be just a puzzle, like, or something that like the players have to think about.
Give them the option of the luck, right? The dice roll is the luck. And then give them the option of skill or creative thinking, ideas on how they approach and handle a situation. Like if again, the luck roll is like, yeah, it's risky, right? Because you could fail and then you'd lose out on something, you'd lose out on time, you lose out on some health or resource, like Sam just said. But then you might also get something bonus. That's where the roll comes in. But you can't block the entire destination or thing behind that luck skill check roll. You can't be like, well, you weren't lucky enough to actually get to the rest of the game. Sorry, you're just gonna be there now until you're lucky enough to get to the rest of the game. Until that luck of yours improves, you're not getting to the rest of the game. It's like what?
No one designs a game like that.
No one is, and everyone hates that type of game. That's terrible. Like we just said with Baldur's Gate 3. They never do that in any way, shape, or form. They have never, ever locked like a specific big thing or an encounter or whatever, or even a reward behind a skill check wall where it's just like, well, you can't do that anymore. It's like there's always another way to get or do something to get there at some point.
To be fair, there are going to be elements where your options aren't the greatest because of decisions you've already made.
Yes,
but it's never completely locking you out of something.
No,
like
never.
The reality is that unless you make such a string of irrational, stupid decisions that now your only option is the worst one, but you chose to make all those choices before, and if your DM is anywhere near decent, they're gonna warn you. You're like, are you sure? Like, is this really what you guys want to be doing? Like, my DMs have done that so many times in one way or another, as to just this kind of like, hey, let's take a second here. This is what you want, and we're all like, yeah, because we're gremlins. But the reality is like the whole point is that if it's a consequence from actual choices being made, that's great. That's world building.
Yes,
it's a consequence because you're going to be a dick
because of a roll, because of a little piece of polychrome like plastic, whatever.
We talked about this with the skills video.
Metal, whatever.
We talked about this with the skills video. Every encounter should have 3 skills. You know, like what did I say? The wall. You have to get through like a hidden door in a wall. There's always so many ways. There's the magic way of like, is this device magical? If it's not, okay, magic way is out the door. I gotta find it. I can either find it with investigation or perception, depending on, you know, what the size of the implement is. Okay, well, I want to use it. Okay, if I don't find it, can I use thieves' tools to try to find any weird things going on? Okay, can't do that. All right, fine. I'm gonna bust it down, because you know what? Everyone can always go buy a pickaxe. It doesn't even matter. The reality is, though, all of these things have different negatives to them.
Here's what I will say too, though, to this whole skill check kind of like debacle that we're talking about here is, here's the thing, and I even came up with an idea again, and I've said it before. If you're going to put a reward, whatever they're trying to do behind a skill check barrier, then the only way that you could ever do that is you got to give them the ability to use other skills besides just simply one skill to get it done. Like, for instance, you know what? Okay, we have a wizard who's got crappy strength, the worst strength ever. You know what? What if you guys be like, you know what? Can I use maybe like investigation on this rock wall to like be able to see like the best places to get like handholds and stuff in order to like pull myself up that way? Maybe instead of having to just use brute strength to pull my, like, can I like, you know, I can see where the best handholds and like the best foundation or whatever I can go to get up there. Like, you know what? Fine. Do that. If you're going to lock it behind a skill check, then you got to give them the ability to use more than just simply one skill to complete or handle this situation. Same thing with like, oh, it's behind a locked door and you don't have a key, or maybe again, oh, the key isn't in normal sight. Oh, you can't pick the lock. Fine. Investigation, perception, find a key, do something. Strength, break the freaking door down. Or,
you know what, Adam, I like your idea. I would personally modify it from my own table, but the reality is like, you're also not, you're also part of a team, right? You have a barbarian who's great at climbing and a wizard who isn't. Well, guess what? Now the wizard can point out the best spots for that barbarian to climb up that wall. And there's nothing saying that that barbarian can't throw a rope down and pull that wizard up.
We would certainly hope.
With help from the wizard using those handholds. They might not have the strength to support themselves climbing up a large rock wall. You know what they do have? Intelligence. So if they have assistance from someone who's strong, they can pick the best route for themselves. There is nothing.
We could even say, they tie each other together, and the barbarian is the one that's using the strength, and due to the wizard's intelligence and the barbarian helping to like hold his body up, that he can again climb up the thing. He doesn't have to use as much strength or whatever to climb.
It's about knowing where to go.
Exactly. And it's like there are so many ways that, again, if GMs are just going to be open to not like just barricading it off and being like, this is the way that you have to, this is the one way to do it. You have to do it this way because I want you to do it this way. And it's like, that type of GM is the absolute worst type of GM. You cannot pigeonhole, you can't pigeonhole, or you can't funnel your players into playing the game one way that you think it should be played. Play it by yourself then. Like that's not, and again, like, don't get me wrong. It's like, I am so much about, again, like, for instance, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we can then talk about, games and players that just do whatever the hell that they want, right? Where they just make up rules on the spot just to suit their thing. It's like, that's also, in my opinion, not a great way to play the game. Because at that point, it's like, it's the same thing. It's like, well, why are we even playing this then? Why don't we just play pretend? Why are we even saying this isn't even D&D now? We're just playing pretend. We're just basically like, we're like 6-year-old kids being like, I stabbed you. No, you didn't. Yes, I did. No, you didn't. I revived myself. I jumped 20 feet in the air and I hit you with the light of heaven's fire. Well, I used the hell flame. Like, it's like, you're just saying stuff now. You're just pretending. You're just saying whatever you want. There is no actual like foundation to be going across to showcase any amount of skill, imagination, or utilization of these core rules and these core, foundations. So it's like, you can't just simply be like, well, I like this, so we're going to do it this way because that's just, it's like, well, okay, then we're not playing the same game then anymore. Like, I think this is something completely different. Like,
if even the pre-written modules, which a lot of people like and some people don't, and some of them are better than others, if even the crappy pre-written modules that are, for the most part, by the community hailed as not too great, even those, if you look at the different encounters and skill checks that they want, usually have more than one option. Now, sometimes there are a couple that have one, or they'll have like two, or it's a little bare bones. But for the most part, pretty much every single one of those encounters, albeit if it's just a social, as long as, like, if it's not just a combat or just a social encounter, have multiple avenues to success. Now, I would urge a new DM or someone who maybe feels like, oh, maybe I kind of lock things behind stuff I shouldn't. I do want to stress this. What we are complaining about is locking major story beats.
Yes.
Now, if you have this idea of like, well, they're going through this crypt and they can get to the boss, they can do all these things, they can complete the story beat and they can go home, heads held high. But maybe there's like a weird locked door they couldn't get through, but it wasn't a major story beat. And the only thing that was behind there was like maybe extra treasure or maybe a bonus thing, but it wasn't important to finishing the story beat.
It's not imperative to the current narrative.
It's just like, oh, that's nice. Like,
it's a little extra. It's a little extra little sprinkle. Like, it's like, hey, if they were lucky enough again to get this thing, it is not at all like,
hell, if they were prepared enough. Like, the reality being is, like, if you say you have a party and you don't have a rogue, well, someone has to know how to pick locks, whether it's through the knock spell, whether it's through someone else getting proficiencies outside of their normal class,
breaking down the door, whatever.
You put effort into this. So if you put enough effort and you do well enough on average, you'll be rewarded for that effort. And so the reality is that your main story beats can have aspects of utilizing those talents, but the reality is that you shouldn't be locking major story things that you are telling them to go do behind an impassable skill wall. The skills should complement what you're throwing at them.
It's
not
supposed
be
to increase the experience of, like, again, it should make a player feel like they are doing something interesting or cool. Like, if anything else, like, even from what we said, it's almost in essence an ability to provide more flavor and a sense of accomplishment or tension. Even is the deliberate aspect of dice rolls. It's meant to provide tension and get people immersed and involved, because they're like, oh man, if I mess this up, this is gonna be a thing. Like, it is a means of providing those effects. And again, that the point of that is to have that, is to be a reasonable and logical, and for it to have a point. If the point is like, oh well, you fail this, you can't progress forward, it's like, that's not what that's used for.
No.
Skill checks are not about saying whether or not you can progress forward. They're about providing tension and immersion and an aspect to the game that makes you feel like, okay, this is what I can do. I'm here. Wow.
I think a party with a diversified skill set provides different avenues of approach. That's the entire point. That's every hero movie where each hero has a specialty and they're all good at one thing, or the newer Suicide Squad movie, I think, was a good example of that. When you had what was the two Idris Elba and John Cena's characters? Bloodsport and Peacekeeper. Where they walked through that military camp and they were just trying to show off which one of them was better at killing people.
Well, because they literally said that they made a joke about that in the movie, where they were like, I'm just you, but better, or whatever. It was like,
but the reality is,
they made a joke about that.
The reality is that each one of the characters in that movie had their own skill set that they brought to the table. And so the reality is if you have a party of individuals who all do different things, then each skill check should be not only just for one of them to shine, but a possibility that if one of them can't, that someone else can step up and maybe try things a different way, because that's how we approach problems in real life.
Exactly.
That is what is satisfying.
Or even for all of them to shine in different ways. To showcase the different aspects of the
working
game.
Together. Who knows?
Classes, it's just hey, you were able to do all of this stuff. We talked about this again, I think, in the skills episode, where it's just a specific check, and you just said it too with the modules, give them the ability to use different skills. And with those different skills, perhaps they get different types of information, or their accomplishment looks slightly different or flavored differently. That's one of the biggest things, but it's you can still get a lot, because so many of the skills are so much are interchangeable, or they intersect and correlate with one another in a multitude of ways. So it's
again, that's another example of why I like what they did with Baldur's Gate.
Yeah, agreed.
There's been times where it's well, you can do this, or you can use this other skill. Both of them have the same
intimidate, deceive, or persuade. Technically, you get the same, like Sam said, end result, but the flavor with how you get there, and maybe even potentially the consequences afterwards, should you maybe fail or even succeed, are different.
Yeah.
And that is a masterful way of doing that. That's the point of a skill check. It is more so, again, it's not a lockdown necessarily of progress. You're still going to progress. You're still going to get to some point regardless. But depending on what you do and how you choose to use skills, the flavor or the outcome can be vastly different and changed.
And I don't think that you have to do that with everything.
Not everything. No, I agree.
There are for example, you're going through a dungeon and there's traps. Certain traps are just going to be dex based. They're just going to be dex based. It's how it was designed. It was supposed to catch you unawares if you're not dexterous. The reality is, if you give them the opportunity to see it and they don't, and some of their party members do better than others at avoiding it, that's just the consequences of not seeing it. That's okay. The reality is things should still be perilous. Things should still be difficult, depending on what you expect your character to be. Not everyone's good at everything, but the reality is that it should never be walking into a permanent dead end with no answers. No. Because it's one of those things that, to me,
can't be
is so unbelievably frustrating as a player, that if I was playing in a game and every time we went down a new area, there was an end result of you didn't roll well enough to go. But the only way for us to continue the story is on the other side of that wall. I'm just not going to play anymore, because it's at that point it's antagonistic. It's antagonistic.
It's straight up just like restrict. Like it's literally like, again, the GM is just tying, like every check he ties another limb. You know, it's like, oh, your first check he ties your right arm. Okay, second check left arm, third check left leg, fourth check right leg. It's like and eventually you get to the point where you're just like, well, and even more so, again, it brings up the biggest question: why?
Yeah,
why are we here? Why are we playing this right now? We're not playing the game. We're just sitting here rolling dice. Like, that's not playing the game. No. Just rolling dice. Like, go play, freaking craps or something. And if you just like to roll dice, like, that's not playing this game. That's not what this is. And that, in essence, I feel like is the biggest question that you should always ask yourself, GMs, and maybe even players too. Always ask yourself, in the current situation, are we playing this game right now? Is this what we're playing? Is this what we're doing right now? Like, and if so, and if we're not, for whatever reason, what do you have to do to get back to playing the game and having fun? Like, because it's like, I will even specifically say, we've been talking about this kind of the stopgap for a bit. Let's talk a little bit about the antithesis, the other end of the spectrum, where you just have people just doing whatever the heck they want. We just referenced it a second before. We're just like, because I'm also currently in a game where it is kind of just like that, where there's like, basically the GM, he's brand new. He specifically said this. He, like, when we first did like a session 0 and a bit of an interview about me joining up.
He is a learning GM.
He's a fledgling GM. He himself has said this. He's like, I'm just getting started. I have a lot to learn. I'm going to make a lot of mistakes. I'm going to mess up a lot, and I'm looking to, hopefully learn and keep going and have a good time. And I'm like, that sounds great to me. That's perfectly fine.
You have a good attitude about it. Like,
there's nothing wrong with that at all. But I will say, like, as I've played, and I think at this point we've had like 3 sessions total, I believe. We're going to have another one pretty soon as well, where I'm like, I'm a little bit on the fence about staying currently. Because I'm feeling like, again, like there's a couple of things where it's just like the party has a bit of an inclination to be slightly like murder hobo-esque / like, just too much wild card shenanigans going on, despite the fact that it's like, the GM, and it shows the GM is definitely new. A lot of his narrative, a lot of what he's kind of putting forth are very kind of simplistic and
one-dimensional.
And it feels a little bit like he's kind of just flying by the seat of his pants a bit. Like, he doesn't necessarily have like a real kind of narrative or idea, because a lot of it is very coincidental. A lot of it is very like Deus Ex Machina-esque, and a lot of it is very railroady in a number of ways. Which, again, like, I say all this, even though I'm saying all of this, don't get me wrong, it's like he's new, and that's okay. Yeah. There's a lot within that can work. There's definitely a lot of potential that I can feel from the game, for sure. And he has very grand, lofty machinations too. And so I hope that, as we continue, hopefully he gets better. But it's definitely a matter of just like, hey, he definitely does not have a great grasp of the rules. And kind of just the baseline rules. For instance, like, there's this one character who like is dual wielding swords and can apparently attack like 4 times, because he was like, because you're dual wielding, it allows you to attack with both hands or both weapons immediately, just with one action, which is like, that is technically not how that works. Like, you can, technically speaking, with the rules, you can, and another aspect of even like with Baldur's Gate, which is cool, is if you take the attack action with, you can usually attack with one weapon, or if you have multi-attack, then you can maybe attack with one weapon and then maybe another weapon. I would be okay with that. And then you can, as a bonus action, technically attack with your offhand.
So, I mean, rules is written. This is something that I had to mess around with my character. Technically,
rules are written.
Technically,
it's your main hand
as
that you attack twice. No matter
how many action, like
a multi-attack. If you have multi-attack, it's usually
extra
just
attack. It's still the one weapon.
It's technically supposed to be the main hand. And then you attack as a bonus action after you have taken the attack action. Only when you've taken the attack action, technically, can you do this.
Yeah.
You can attack with your offhand. Now, again, I do feel like if you're dual wielding, it's like, and you have multi-attack, I personally don't necessarily have a problem being like, hey, you can choose to attack with either one. And then I feel like it's just basically based off of the fact that it's like, hey, because if you're ambidextrous, then it's like, hey, you know what I mean?
Well,
you attack with one, and then it's like, because you used like most of your strength for the main action to attack, whatever weapon you last attacked with for your last attack action, like you then have to use the other one for that. Like your offhand attack is just not going to be as strong because you ran out of steam, so to speak.
The way I would be okay with it is your first attack has to be your main hand weapon. And then anything after that, whether it's because most of the time dual wielder, most fighters that are like high level fighters, they don't dual wield because there's no reason to have a bonus action attack. There's usually other things you can do with your bonus action. But say you're like a ranger, you only get 2 attacks max. So you're a dual wielding ranger. For me, your first attack is with your main hand. Your second attack and your bonus action attack might be with the offhand weapon. I think that's fine. The reality is like you shouldn't be able to just switch off whatever, all the time, no matter what.
And you definitely shouldn't, just because you have weapons in both hands, be able to attack, like especially if you only have like one attack. If you have like one attack action, you can't attack twice just because you have a weapon in both hands.
It takes a bonus action to use your bonus weapon.
And then especially because you have 2 attacks a turn, doesn't mean you should be able to attack 4 times because you have 2 like that's a lot. And he said, I noticed this as one of the characters we're attacking. I'm like, oh, shouldn't you only be able to attack twice, like just once with the one weapon? He's like, oh, well, it was a matter of me kind of, I guess, like misunderstanding the rules or whatever. I think, and like basically like dual wielding is like super busted and overpowered now, where you can like attack like as long if you have 2 weapons, you can attack twice with one action. And I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, all right. And again, he didn't necessarily seem to change or switch it up. And so it's kind of just like, and he didn't say anything about it. So I'm like, that particular dynamic of like that makes the game, like he even said, like far more busted and overpowered in a lot of ways.
For me as a player, if I walked into a table and someone said that, I'd be like, did you read the book? And if they responded with, well, no, I did. And the DM's like, well, I'm like, read the passage and then you tell me what you want to rule. And if the DM's like, I don't like that you're talking like that, I'm like, all right, bye.
Yeah, no,
I'm not gonna do it. For me,
and that's okay. Like I said, like again, like it's like as like I don't have an issue with changing up certain rules once again, because like we said, there's no objectively necessarily wrong way to play the game as long as you're having fun. Like, so as long as, again, and I even say like, hey, it's like I understand you want to be cool, you want to have like a dope kind of thing, you want to show this. It's like the only issue too being though is that I believe he's the only character that is dual wielding at all. And so he clearly has like a clear advantage over basically everybody else. I will also say that this GM has a DM PC currently with the party as well, which I know a lot of people have a lot of feelings about DM NPCs, like all up and down the road. Personally, I feel like they are not necessarily always just objectively bad. Like, I feel like there are ways that they can be a decent addition so long as they do not overshadow the party, for one. They're not like, you don't like, because they can even be used almost as like a guide tool from the GM if a party is having trouble, if the GM maybe isn't like explaining or has like, a much more deliberate outline of what to do or where to go. The GM NPC or the GM PC can be a great tool to be like, hey, maybe we should try this. Maybe, it can help maybe give a little bit more direction or context to a situation.
Yeah, my GM always do. DM PCs are lower level.
Yeah, so and even if they're not lower level, if you want to like throw like, because like I feel like GM PCs are like, if you have a small party, right, it can be helpful to help like, shore up the numbers a little bit for an encounter, and maybe even be used again primarily though as support is usually how they should be. Is they shouldn't overshadow the rest of the main party, and they should be used primarily as a support network for the party. That being the case, though, there are a lot of ways for that to go horribly wrong. And his GM NPC definitely has already shown a couple of behaviors that are like almost inflicting certain things on the party without the party like, necessarily wanting to do that. Yeah. And so and again, like I said, I feel like if nothing else, this is an interesting thing to be in, as like, hey, he's a fledgling GM. He doesn't seem like a bad guy at all. He just seems like a guy who's trying to have fun and maybe is forgetting a little bit about the responsibility as a GM. I think he might be like a player who wants to play. And so he's like, well, I'm going to GM in order to play, or even because I like GMing, I think it'd be cool. And maybe is kind of not taking the amount of responsibility that it falls to a GM because of that, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And the GM has the greatest responsibility because they have the greatest power in the game.
As you know, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that's the same.
It absolutely
that's the other side of that coin. Unfortunately,
yeah, it absolutely can. And so it's like that's when you're involved in that kind of way, it can be hard not to tweak things to be in your favor or what you want. So and again, we'll see. But again, he showed a lot of promise. He showed a lot of potential. And so, but I definitely am kind of questioning at the moment. Like I'm like I don't know if how much longer I'll be sticking with this group or not. But I'm still interested maybe to at least test the waters and to see. I would like to maybe have a bit more of a talk, or at least, hopefully to showcase at the very least as part of the game, like, hey, these are maybe some of the consequences or maybe some of the reactions that can come from kind of choosing to model your game in this particular way. But that in essence, people, is like, that's, I guess, the example wanting to give of like, hey, this is kind of what happened if you just kind of fly by the seat of your pants, right? You don't have any real foundation. You don't have any real plan. In fact, you flip and change stuff on the fly all the time, and you just allow random stuff to just happen constantly. It's like there is a fair reason why there are these baseline rules or guidelines for how the game should be played. Like, this is the thing that's like, this is supposed to help keep it relatively balanced. And in my opinion, I like working in certain confines because that, again, provides a certain amount of challenge to like get around those confines, but still within the dynamics of the game, right? Like that, I feel like that is a real accomplishment. That's what's most fun. Instead of just simply being like, well, trying to find a way around this is inconvenient and annoying, so I'm just going to instead just get rid of it entirely to make it as convenient as possible just to do this thing that I want to do, right?
No, put in the effort to make
put in the effort to get to this point, but within the building of the game, where it's just like, hey, you can get a 25 AC, but just still vanilla in the game. And it's amazing. It's fun to figure out. It's like a puzzle, right? I like puzzles, and I know not everybody likes puzzles. I know, I get that. But I feel like that in essence is the charm of the game, where it's like you figure out how to do this thing, not simply from the convenience of just changing everything to suit your needs or your preferences right away, but to find, and in essence, I feel like that's almost kind of like life or any other thing. It's like you find a way to try and do this within this established kind of rules of engagement. But if that's what people want to do, people do just want to be like, we just want to get rid of this. We just want to do this thing. It's like, all right, more power to you. But I don't think me or Sam can really be in that game or
no. I like look. And the problem is, I'm definitely more spiteful than you are, Adam. But
I mean, you have a lower tolerance for stuff. I don't know if you're more spiteful than I am, but you have a far lower tolerance, and maybe you're
I don't have patience. Yeah.
No. Yeah. No. You don't.
The reality,
you're probably a bit more petty than I am. Yeah.
The reality is that this all comes kind of down to finding the right game for you, because there are always going to be players who don't really want to deal with a very serious game, and DMs who don't really want to DM a serious game, and vice versa. And I think you'll, especially if you play with people on the internet or just play with random people at a game store, sometimes it's a good fit, sometimes not everyone's a good fit. It's back and forth. I think for us, an attempt to kind of balance out, like, because you can be an easygoing GM in terms of the seriousness or letting people have fun, but you can still also hold a standard to your game. And I think, that's where my machinations lie. I've played in games that are less serious, and I think that's okay. But at the same time, like, I'm not expecting you to be, oh, serious. Everything has to be, oh my God. Like, no.
You don't have to be like a super edgelord or whatever,
but I at least would like the game to be held to a certain standard. And I think, you could have a happy-go-lucky group and story, and maybe some things don't have the same consequences that other tables would have, but at the very least, there should be a set of standards. And I think, whatever kind of GM you want to be, I hope you're not going to be the antagonistic asshole GM, because that's the worst kind.
Certainly one of the worst. That's for damn sure.
I think antagonistic DMing is the worst kind. Overall.
I mean, I guess let me ask real quick too, like, because I wonder if this would be considered antagonistic GM, because it's like, you know, the cringe campaign, the legendary cringe campaign that I was a part of, that I've told you a bit about, Sammy. And I think I also told a little bit to everybody else, maybe even the last episode that we did about this kind of particular subject, where, you know, the GM was literally the type where he had nothing planned. He literally every session just made everything up on the spot, and it was horrible. It was absolutely horrendous. It was the worst game, bar none, that I have ever played before, like in multitude of ways. Where he basically, like, every session would be almost an entirely new dynamic or entirely new narrative that didn't make any sense to the previous, and he would just come up with stuff randomly. And he had at least the fantasy know-how or experience and knowledge to at least, I guess, kind of set up, like, you know, the absolute baseline of some kind of narrative or environment or whatever. But then he would just all like characters, he would just basically do that exact thing we just talked about. He would shut down almost every character about doing something. He didn't know anything really about the game's mechanics at any capacity. He would constantly just make up rules. Like, he was the guy that I told you, Sam, that, like, literally we were in a building and he just detonates the building. It's like, okay, everybody takes 132 points of damage. And we're like, do we get like a save or anything? He's like, well, how would you possibly get a save? The thing just detonated like right underneath you. Like, and we were all like, no, we're not just gonna take 132 points of damage because you say we are. Like, the game literally said almost every situation you get a chance to save to at least have the damage. He's like, oh, fine. Well, people on the first floor, you can't. You just take all the damage. People on the second floor, you can take half damage or whatever. And it's like,
yeah, no, that is antagonistic.
How is that? Like, because again, it's just he just wants to establish a narrative of his own without any true, again, you're not even playing the game at that point. You're literally just trying to do whatever you want to just have fun or to glorify yourself at that point. And he did stuff like that all the time, where he just didn't want to use any mechanics. He just wanted to basically, he's the one that took control of a player's character, like, basically indefinitely, because they failed 2 checks. They rolled like a 1 on a check and then failed like another check, and they were just like apparently enslaved now by this entity that just started to do whatever they wanted to them, and without even the other players' consent or even knowledge. Like, it was just like, what are you doing? Like, this isn't the game. We're not even playing this game anymore. Like, and people, like, specifically that kind of thing. It's like, and the biggest part being is like he didn't think he was even doing anything wrong. That's what I'm saying. It's like he wasn't necessarily, like, maybe to that one player who he enslaved, I think there was some weird kind of thing towards them, maybe. But to everybody else, he even liked me, apparently. Like, I was one of his most favorite people in that campaign. Like, and he would often try to give me special treatment and stuff. And I'm like, bro, like,
antagonistic isn't exactly a personal, or violent thing necessarily. It's DMing it without the players as the centerpiece. So doing things that your players have no control over just because that's what you want to do, that's antagonistic. Putting players in positions that they have no interaction or choice with, that's antagonistic. Not giving players an out for things or respecting boundaries is antagonistic. It is a negative play style, because you're not playing with the characters, you're playing against them. And that could be in many different facets of the game. Matt Colville has a very beautifully articulated video about antagonistic DMing, because it's easy to slip into if you're not careful, and especially like
that's the most dangerous thing about it.
There's definitely DMs who are not outwardly antagonistic, and it's very little things. It's certain aspects that you're like, oh
yeah, it's subtle, and you kind of be okay vibe. With. Yeah, you got a vibe.
You're kind of like, well, if that's all that they're really gonna do, like, I can deal with that. But what you're describing is entirely at the expense of the players at the table, and not for any real reason either. So
well, just for his own gratification and
not
pleasure,
only is
basically.
Not only is it antagonistic, it's not even well thought out.
No,
which makes it. Which, to be fair, if it was well thought out and antagonistic, I guess that'd be worse. Because if he's flying by the seat of his pants making a decision, I guess there's some culpability to just, not having it all there. But the reality being is
just not very smart for one thing.
To be honest, like, it's antagonistic. Aside from the intelligence of this DM, it's antagonistic.
Because I guess that would have been my biggest question. Is like, can it be considered antagonistic if it's almost like based out of just ignorance, obliviousness, and just straight up maybe narcissism and selfishness?
Yes, I think it still is. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. If it's because I think it might be accurate to say like he wasn't like intentionally trying to like
no, but he still made the decisions.
People. But he
enslaved the character.
Even then it's like he still was like he was trying to justify, like he's like, well, but there are specific narrative like dialogues or specific narrative beats and roads to go down that sometimes it requires you to take away player agency, which again, to be fair, as we said before,
that's a different kind of agency,
but that's a whole different vibe. It's a completely different thing what he's doing. That's opposed, because not only was he like,
that's autonomy, that's taking player autonomy away, which you do not want to do.
Not just autonomy, he was literally like yanking the character away from the player.
You don't do that,
and doing everything like basically making all the decisions this character would make, like without the player's consent or even really awareness. And even more so, it's like you can't, again, that's basically on the same level of domination, right? Like when you dominate a character in order to like control them, again, those spells exist, but we just said with the caveat that they are incredibly short duration. They don't last, at most they last for what, an hour maybe, and even with that, it's like that's,
and it also doesn't,
a lot of those are much higher level spells, and
it also doesn't completely take away player agency, because technically the player still has control of them. They just have to make different decisions.
That's with charm. Domination, you technically can choose to take direct control.
Yeah, but I mean, like,
even
you can still have the player play the character.
It's true.
Now with the new objective, which I think is a fun thing to do.
I think it'd be really fun too, but obviously
that's what we do.
that would have to be with the players, because some players might feel like awkward about being like, I have to attack my friends now.
Yeah.
And it's like, I have dominated you and ordered you to do this thing. So
one of my favorite things, and you have to have an open mind as a player, I think, to do this, is you get dominated and like, my favorite thing is to hear a DM go, okay, that is now your enemy. How would you attack them? How would your character most efficiently take them down? Mm-hmm. And the reality is that what I would do to the person I was just fighting is now what I would do to them, which means I would pull out all the stops like I normally would.
Yeah.
And some players might be like, well, that's not fair. And it's like, but they're giving me the agency to play a dominated character. As to what a dominated character do you think that I would pull my punches?
Essentially, the question to ask is like, again, the person who you were just attacking with all your fervor, with all your like whatever,
is now your best friend.
Is now that person. Think of it like this person, their whole form just they changed bodies right now.
Yeah, they switched places.
They switched places. That person is now this person who you thought this person was. That's all that is. And again, some players, again, I understand, like, you feel bad or whatever, but it's like, well, that's the point. This is, again, doing that in that particular situation is a reason why, again, the duration is limited and short.
And also why hitting them can change the
and hitting them can take it off of them. Hitting them can potentially
hitting the person who cast it.
Yeah, it would have to be the guy getting rid of concentration. Yeah, regardless, also why, again, it's a concentration spell. It's the reason being is that these situations are supposed to be incredibly isolated and short, intense moments, being like, hey, they're in this situation now, like this is emotionally jarring and wrenching. It can be heart-wrenching where you're like, I don't want to, because again, this player is like, well, I don't want to attack my friends. Like, well, you have to, and you're going to.
Yeah, action
So
economy has
how are you
changed.
going to do that? And not just that, but it's also like your friends are like, damn, we have to attack our friend now? Like we have to like knock them out? And then it's like, okay, now your entire resources are being dedicated against yourself now, and you're going to start losing health if you even somehow are able to get, you know, the spell to stop. You just lost health without dealing any or as much to your enemy now.
Like, I think you know, there's a case to be made, in my opinion, to being like Batman in Justice League and paying attention to all the strengths and weaknesses of your party members. In the case that one day one of you turns evil or dominated.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And that's something that I do, and
Me
a lot
too.
of people don't.
Yeah,
and I definitely have gotten some shit from people because
it's like how to take them down. You know how to shut them down.
Yeah,
like literally, my character has done that in a campaign before, where like our barbarian got dominated or whatever, and I was just like, okay, banishment. I just banished them. I just banished them for like, you know, until we could get rid of the concentration. The concentration, and then I brought them back. It's like, because there's no way for them to have succeeded on a charisma save against my character.
And I think
their charisma wasn't high enough, and my DC was way too high. There was just no way they would have succeeded. And so I just, you know, took them
I
out.
do want to touch on, since we've already been talking about like player agency is a concept. I think, you know, as a DM, I think there are times in a story where it might be appropriate to not completely remove player agency, but put them in a situation that they don't really have a choice of being in,
or they have really bad choices to choose from.
Well, and not because you have some sort of stupid story beat you want to make sure happens, so you just put them in a situation they don't want to be in, but for decisions that they make. I'll give example. I currently have a character that is psionic based character. So I have taken, you know, like I have weird illithid artifacts, and I've spent time with weird illithid things and gained powers that I shouldn't really have. And because of, and at every turn when I was taking this power, my DM was like, yes, this feels good, but there is definitely like there is some sort of curse or some sort of thing that's happening to you that is negative that you can't.
I mean, I was going to say understand. Another great parallel is Baldur's Gate 3. That same exact done, like, you know, during the game, and like we don't want to necessarily spoil too much, but I will just say in the game, you can basically start like embracing a darker, more like malevolent power and ability that can begin to have legitimate like effects or detriments for your character. Not necessarily in
it's not detriments in the traditional sense,
like in a mechanical sense, but like your party members are going to start feeling ways. There's going to be like physical traits that you're going to start noticing a bit that are different, and like it can change some stuff. That's
my current character. One of his like there's the illithid whip, the mind lash. It's like a legacy illithid weapon.
Yeah.
My DM gave me like a different version of it. It was like more powerful. It had in like a save built into it.
I was gonna say really whips usually are pretty weak unless you have to tweak them a bit to make them.
It was tweaked pretty heavily, but the reality is that the longer I spent with this weird illithid armor, that it was like almost, it was like a symbiote kind of holding on to me, and it like takes away hit dice and shit like that.
Oh yeah, no, that's like
it's living armor.
Yeah, the living armor, yes.
Which he upgraded, so it's like better AC, and then he gave me this whip, and he's like, these things are both interacting with you. I've found like fragments of psionic power and things like that.
That's a risk,
like,
bud.
Oh, do you absorb the heart? And I'm like,
yes.
He's like, is that really what you want to do? I'm like, is that what it's telling me to do? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, okay. So I did it, and I know full well, I'm like, shit's gonna happen to me. Like we always make jokes about
it's not a great look.
Like, you know, I stuck my head in the Ichor of Dendar to get information, which means Dendar owns my soul, but I have like weird illithid mutations. I don't know. Like I don't have basically ownership over what's going to happen to me, but I did it knowing full well that was going to happen.
You chose that still.
So like one day I woke up and the whip was no longer the whip. It was formed into the end of the armor, and I no longer had my left hand.
Yep.
He said, he was like, that hand can be used as a weapon. You can still hold things with it. You could pick locks with it. You could still use it as a hand. But he's like, your character now is forever deformed for the situation, like the things that you chose to do. He's like, there could be high forms of magic that could fix it. There could be other avenues to reverse this.
And that's the biggest
decisions that you made at every corner I told you, and you made them anyway, and now you're here. And that's not a bad thing.
That's different.
Now,
that is entirely different.
Some players might not like that. They say, well, I don't want my character to look like that.
Well,
and it's like, well,
you
the
made
DM
those
gave
choices.
you chances.
Yeah, and it's still giving you chances. Like, okay, you don't want your character to look like that anymore, then go on a
do
quest
research
to restore and to heal your character, but you're going to lose out on the power and abilities that you gain from these things. Then that is the fair trade.
You know, if I woke up one day and my DM was like, hey, you picked up an object, like one thing, I didn't tell me anything about it, we cast identify, I spent time with it and I felt nothing weird, and then 2 days later he's like, yeah, you have tentacles for arms. That's not the same.
That's not the same thing, no.
And that's kind of what the DM you were talking about. That's kind of what it sounds like. Is like he was just arbitrarily like, that's
and on more than one. He wouldn't tell us. He literally, like, again, specifically in reference to the other player's character. We were in the middle of a random fight, and he literally was just like, roll a wisdom save, and he was like, okay, and he rolled a 1. He's like, oh man. Roll a charisma save, and he apparently failed that save, even though he rolled, I think, decently. And then all of a sudden, just like arms from like he says, my character sees arms from a different dimension or a portal, like reach out, grab them, and pull them in. And then apparently, like, next turn, she just got dumped out of another portal or whatever, and then apparently she was just enslaved now. And it was just like, that had nothing to do with anything that we were doing currently. It was completely separate. Again, a completely random occurrence that he just pulled out of his ass, delivered it, and was just like, yeah, you got a nat 1, so you just fail. And he was that kind of GM again too. He was just like, you got a nat 1, you are just, and it was just like, bro. And even when we get like a nat 20, it was like, it was barely anything good would happen. Yeah. He literally at one point had also like asked us, it was like our sorcerer, we were in a fight with these bees or whatever, which was another really dumb. He didn't even know, Sam, this man didn't even know how to run a combat. He didn't even know initiative. He wouldn't even call for initiative in a combat encounter. Literally stuff would happen and he would just be like, okay, who's doing what? What are you guys doing? And everybody would like look at each other or proverbially look at each other because we were all online, but everybody would just be quiet for a second. And then like, I'd be like, I'm going to do this. And another person would be like, I'm going to do that. And then another 2 people would be like, well, we're going to, and he's like, okay, well, what's happening? Who's doing what? And I'm like, isn't this like a good time to probably roll initiative for this situation? To, he's like, oh, okay, yeah, everybody like roll initiative. And we would always have to be the one to ask him. He wouldn't ask when something happened. So literally when this happened, I'm like, okay, we should probably roll initiative to see who does what. He would literally forget what happened 2 seconds ago, what a person would do, and would be like, okay, he's going to do this thing to you. And I'm like, I'm not anywhere near him. He's like, where'd you go? I'm like, I moved away. I said that last time. I'm like up through this hole or through this door. And he's like, oh, well, okay. And it was horrible. It was horrendous. And we get in this situation where we're fighting these bees, and to be fair, a lot of the players too were not the best, because like our sorcerer, she just ends up like, she's like, all right, I'm gonna cast fireball, and we're like, okay, we're in this 30 by 30 foot hole. Literally, it's a 30 by 30 foot room in a hole that we went into in order to get this stuff or whatever. And the GM's like, we're all like, are you sure you want to do that? Like, she's like, yeah. And we're like, all right, that's, it was, we're all going to get hit. That's fine. It was like, okay, some of us were like, or resistant to fire. And some of us had like, some of us were rogues. And so we were like, we had evasion at that point. And so it was like, okay, cool. And the GM's like, all right, roll your damage. And she rolled like 36 or 42 damage or something. It was pretty high. And he was just like, all right, everybody just takes 42 damage. And we're like, wait, what? What do you mean? We need to make a save. Like we made the saves. We're fine. Like, or some of us are fine. Some of us take half damage. And he's like, what do you mean? You guys are like a 30 by 30 foot thing. That's a 20 foot radius spell. He didn't even know that. He literally asked her. He's like, how big is the spell? She's like, it's a 20 foot radius. And he's like, well, there's no way you guys could dodge. How are you going to dodge out of the way of the fire? And it's like, that's not how the spell works. It's not how these mechanics work. It's not about how close the fire is to you. Because I made the argument. I'm like, literally, you could just say that any time then. You could just literally have a person fire a fireball right between your legs and explode. And you're saying that they still don't get a chance to save? The spell literally says, it doesn't matter the environment or the space that you're in. The only way that you probably wouldn't be able to dodge is if like, oh, something swallows you and you're inside of it. Or even restrained, you technically don't automatically fail dex saves. You get disadvantage, I think. If you're paralyzed or unconscious or whatever, you automatically fail. Restrained, I believe you still have a chance, but you're at disadvantage. Like either way, there are very few
disadvantage.
Very few moments or situations where you just straight up don't get to even save at all with this. Especially if it's like you're a rogue or a monk who you have evasion, and the whole point of this is that you make saves for this kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's like if I'm paralyzed, is the only reason I'm going to automatically fail that.
Yeah, if the explosion is literally happening inside of me, yeah, maybe if the wizard was able to like shoot the bead of fire into my mouth and down my throat and explode, yeah, I probably can't make a save.
No, you got to do it with delayed blast fireball.
Yeah,
so you put it in their sandwich.
Yes,
and then they eat it, and then you explode it while it's inside.
Yeah, or you use like Odaluk's frozen sphere or whatever, and you like create like the little bead, and you just force feed it into them and close their mouth. And then technically, though, I still think that's actually Constitution. So technically, they would still be able to make the save even then. Yeah. Either way, point being is like with that kind of stuff, it's like you can't just retroactively change core rules. And then like the barbarian who was also part of the party then tried to make the argument. He's like, well, before we changed the rules of how like magic or how bonus actions and normal action magic works for the sorcerer, when it was like, you know, she would do a thing where she would cast a spell and then her meta magic would do quicken spell. So then she could cast a cantrip as a bonus action.
Which is exactly rules as written.
Well, again, to be fair, he's like, well, she can't necessarily do that because the rules as written say you can only cast a bonus action spell and then a cantrip of one action. So you can't technically like switch up and do both of those or whatever. And it's like, okay, let's just take a second here. All right, it doesn't specifically say that you can't.
Well, no, that's the funny thing is because we've had this discussion before. I believe
rules as written.
When you cast a spell that has a casting time of one action, cantrips are an action spell. They are a spell. So casting time of one action, you can spend 2 sorcery points to change the casting time to a bonus action. The rule is not that you can't quicken a cantrip. In fact, it is preferable to quicken a cantrip than quickening a spell. Now, in my games, quickening a cantrip only costs 1 sorcery points because sorcerers are underpowered. But the reality being is like they're not even arguing correctly.
That's what I'm saying.
It doesn't say if it said leveled spell, that'd be different.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, because again, the specific stipulation caveat is it's talking about some spells require a casting time of a bonus action. In such cases, you are not able to then cast another spell with a casting time of one action unless it is a cantrip with a casting time of one action. So technically speaking, if you have something else that helps to offset that, there is nowhere in the thing that says that you cannot cast a spell with a casting time of an action and then another spell as a bonus action, like it, or even a cantrip as a bonus. Like if you can do it the other way, there's no reason you can't do it the inverse if you have some ability that allows you to, or if you have like a cantrip that is a bonus action. To be fair, again, most cantrips are not bonus actions. They're not. Most cantrips are all actions, and that is probably why they specifically wrote it that way. But rules as written, there is nothing that says that you can't cast an action spell and then a bonus action cantrip. Like there's nothing that says that. If you have the action economy, you can do that. Like, or if you have an ability that allows you to do it. And so it's like, that's just like, but he kept arguing. He wanted to argue. It's like, well, we made that caveat or the GM ruled that. So he's already changing rules. So you shouldn't be arguing with the fact that he says that we can't make a deck save or whatever. And it's like, bro, you are just feeling butthurt and salty over the fact that your stupid argument was overruled. And so now you want to try and act like, oh, well, this is just par for the course. It's like, this is just the GM being an asshole here. Like, this is like, you're just being petty and shitty because you got your ass slapped. Because you couldn't argue like or whatever. Either way,
because you didn't read is really what it is.
And I don't know. It was whatever. That dude was an asshole the entire game. Like his character was a dick mostly to my character. He was kind of an overall dick bear, but he seemed to always have a very pointed thing towards my character for whatever reason, which was annoying. But either way, that kind of, again, dynamic and mentality in a game to basically just be like, yeah, and again, I understood in an essence maybe why the GM was like, yeah, you guys don't get a save. It's like, I'm going to punish this character for making this dumb decision. And it's like, she already is going to be punished. All right. She just blew up a literal bomb with all her friends and herself in there. And yeah, the player, she was kind of like, you know, gung-ho, kind of a bit of a that person who wasn't wasn't really being very considerate and causing kind of problems. The players will handle that too themselves and being like, hey, stop blowing up fireballs where we're all in you know, range of it. Like, we're not going to necessarily like that of her character. And even more so, you shouldn't punish every other character in the party for the actions of what one player chose to do as a bit of a troll. Like, that is not the way to handle that situation at all. Like, again, having that thing where it's just like, yeah, everybody suffers for the actions of this one player making dumb, stupid decisions. It's like, here's the thing. Yes, that is something that can happen. And while I don't necessarily think you should be like, well, no, you can't detonate a fireball in here with all your friends. She can. She made that decision. That is something that can and does happen. But the consequences of that should then come down afterwards. Hey, we're not going to let you do that anymore. The party needs to be like, you need to stop doing that or leave. You're not going to be a part of the party if you're going to literally be okay with killing all of us. Like, that's just how that works. The GM has to then be like, okay, you know, back the party up with that. Or the GM needs to tell her that herself. Be like, hey, you need to either change your character's mentality to do this kind of thing, or you need to change a character to a character that wants to cooperate and be with the party. Yeah. And it's just like, again, with stuff like that, oh my God, like it just, I have interacted with a multitude of really bad DMs and not great players, and let me tell you, y'all, you know, in essence, there are a lot of problem things. I've read all kinds of stories online about problem players. Again, we talked about some of the archetypes, problem players, problem DMs, you know. In essence, as we always say, you know, the best thing to do is communicate as best you can. I do also know, take it from me personally, I am also under the belief it's like, sometimes you just kind of know when talking won't really do anything. You know, you can get a vibe of a person. I will, though, say, even as a person who believes, it's just like sometimes I've absolutely made the decision where I'm like, it's not worth it to talk to this person. Because I've tried multiple times. Like with that cringe DM, I talked with him multiple times about what was happening. You know, I was like, hey, dude, this is really messed up. This is not okay. We shouldn't be doing this. Like, you know. And he was just like, well, this, that. And he seemed apologetic at first, but then he would do the same thing again. And eventually I was like, all right, you know what? I'm done. I can't do this. And I'm done with this. This is garbage. It's crap. You have gone way too far. Again, when he started to enslave like that player character, I'm like, you know what? I can't even do it anymore. And again, I was one of the people he liked the most in the game. Like, he would give me like extra XP because I was like the only one who would really role play. He would give me like extra like powerful items and stuff to stay in the game and stuff. And I was like, okay, you know, thanks. That's nice. I appreciate that, you know, but I can't, I'm not staying, bro. I can't do it. This is all kinds of messed up beyond belief. Like I am not cool with this, man. You cannot do this to a player character and then subsequently that player. And it was that player's first time ever playing a real long-term campaign on top of that. Like, that's what even made it even more just sad and heartbreaking to me. I'm like, this is the first like long-term campaign that they've ever got the chance to play, and this is what they experience. God dang, bro. Like, that broke my heart. And I was like, no, man, I'm not doing this. And I'm pretty sure that group probably disbanded and broke up after I left. Like, because I told the other player too. I'm like, hey, you should be aware of what's happening to your character right now. Just in case, here you go. And I like sent him the screenshots of the conversation. He was like, yeah, I had no idea. Thank you. I'm like, you should probably leave. I'm leaving this group. And I honestly, I would suggest you leave too. And he's like, yeah, I think I'm leaving too. And I'm pretty sure, like, because literally at that point, 4 other people had already left the campaign previously. Like we only had like 3 of the original people that had first started the game. Everyone else left because of obvious reasons, you know. And I gave this guy multiple chances and multiple opportunities where I talked to him like, hey man, this is how this is feeling, this is how this is coming across. Because again, I felt and I knew to a certain extent, I'm like, he's not necessarily intentionally trying to be horrible. He legitimately believes that what he is doing is providing, like, you know, an interesting narrative and you know, story. And I'm like, no, dude, you're just being an asshole. Nobody likes that. Nobody's really having fun with this. You're just messing things up, you know. And he was an incredibly arrogant, narcissistic guy who thought he knew way more than he actually did. It was a hilarious stereotype of like that guy neckbeard kind of dudes, right? Who are like so narcissistic, believing that like he knew all this stuff. Like he was like, I've been playing and GMing this game for like, you know, 3 decades or whatever. And he knew nothing about the rules. He knew nothing about anything. It was like, how can you sit there and act like you have any, like, you're like a so-called veteran at this when you're absolutely atrocious and you know nothing about even the most simple of rules? Like, what?
Yeah. Well, I think that shows you should not look at yourself. Like, being narcissistic as a DM is not a helpful quality.
Oh, not at all.
I think being humble and actually respecting that there are other people at the table.
You can be confident, right? You can be confident.
Confidence is great.
Is what you know. You can be like, hey, I've spent some time. I have experience. I know what I'm talking about. But just as I think we've said at some point or other, in no way, shape, or form should you believe yourself to be infallible. In no way, shape, or form should you believe yourself to be, you know, unerring, that you know everything, that you're perfect. Like, no.
Couldn't possibly make a mistake.
No, you should absolutely be aware that even though you have a ton of experience, you've read the books multiple times, you can still misremember things.
Oh, I make mistakes. I've played and read and did all this. I make mistakes all the time, and I get called out, and I hate the feeling, but it's the best. Like, that's a good thing.
It's definitely not a great feeling, but for me, I kind of turn it into a good feeling where I'm like, because what I want, I'm like, oh, I was wrong. My fault. I'm glad. Like that. That's cool. If I was wrong about that ruling or about that rule, awesome. Like, thank you for letting me know and helping me to remember the correct kind of ruling so that we can make informed decisions. Like, that's, you should always be just like as clear and precise about, like, you know, words, meanings behind words or rules or whatever, in order to better come to an overall understanding on what you're trying to convey or do. That is the whole point. Yeah. And so you can have, again, make more, hell, if you don't like a rule, it's like, well, at least, you know, maybe you should understand how it works before you choose to just get rid of it. Once you understand how it works, then you can make an informed decision about whether or not this does truly work and jive with the party and the game, or if maybe you should tweak it a bit, or maybe just get rid of it entirely. But don't just look at something and, like, you know, be like, yeah, I don't want that.
I mean, it's also one of those things of, like, instead of just scrapping things because you don't like them, maybe think of a way to compromise. The reality is that at the end of the day, you're playing this with a group of people. If you want to play stuff by yourself, we'll go play stuff by yourself, and you can make all the decisions. But as a DM, where you might have the final say on something in a way, you have to look at how everybody else feels at your table. Because if you constantly make decisions that put your players at odds, they're not going to want to stay with you. And I mean, what you were talking about is a good example. If you're going to constantly act that way towards your players, they're not going to stick around. And I think that's something that GM should keep in mind, is like, you might not like every rule in the game, but if your players like playing a certain way and you just completely disregard it at every turn, you're not going to keep your players. So there's, you know, compromise is a thing,
and you'll have no game.
You'll have no game. Without the players, you have no game. Without the DM, you have no game. So the reality is that it's supposed to be a compromise. It's supposed to be, you know, making ends meet in the middle somewhere, or setting expectations before you start doing anything and then holding people to it. That's why session zeros exist. It's why talking outside of the table is a good idea, because if you set expectations as a DM and everyone agrees with them and everyone's fine with them, and then you get to the actual playing and they completely disregard it, then you have every right to call them out or stop playing. Now you can get into arguments, or there's issues where some people might have originally liked your idea, but then when they've gone through with it, they don't like it. Well, if you don't like what you originally agreed to, again, you talk with them outside the game and see if there's any way to change that. I think, your position of wanting to leave and telling another guy to leave was 100% the right one, but there's, you gave chances in an attempt to maybe change what the trajectory of that game was. And I think, as a DM, you can do that to players, but you have to be ready for it to be directed at you as well. And I think a lot of GMs, as we've talked about, I think are too prideful of what they wanted to do.
Well, maybe it becomes a bit of a literal God complex,
and I think having too much pride in that sense can be detrimental, because it's like, your way is not the only way. This isn't a my way or the highway situation of like, I'm right, you're wrong 100% of the time. No, it's just, that's not how it works in the real world either. And so it's like, there's parallels there. Don't act like you're the most important person at the table, because it's not going to help you, and it's not going to help the people that are playing at your table. And if I know anything about people, they're not going to stick around to deal with your stupid ass.
most will not. Most are not like me, who they'll be like, you know what? Hey,
I'll give them a chance.
You're showing some promise. You know what? Because I've got some pretty thick skin overall about most things. There are very like specific things where I have like super thin skin, where I'm like, bro, that specific thing, if you start poking that thing, I'm like, I have no tolerance or patience at all. But for a lot of it, I do, because I'm like, hey, nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes. I make mistakes. You know what I mean? We all got our thing. And everybody, at least in my opinion, should be given an opportunity to grow and shift, especially if it's like, it's not an intentional thing, right? They're not necessarily intentionally trying to come off as this kind of thing, but a lot of people do though. Again, the unfortunate aspect being is that even if it's not intentional, once you give them that choice and once you give them that awareness, we're like, hey, this is what's kind of coming across. And if they still maintain that stance, then that shows that it is a choice. Then that switches it from being like they were unaware or ignorant to being that now they are complicit. They are now
consciously making.
They are consciously choosing that this is my stance. This is what I believe in. Like, no, you're wrong. Even if they're like still trying to like maintain that sense of like obliviousness or so-called plausible deniability, that's like, no, I'm not doing that. That's not true. That still shows you that the fact that they're not even listening to you, to what you're saying and what you're trying to communicate and tell them, that shows that on some level they actually are aware, and they're just choosing to stay in denial about it as best as they can, because they cannot handle facing that reality a lot of the time. That at least in my experience, that seems to be a lot of the case. That certainly seemed to be the case with this gentleman that we've been talking about, specifically in terms of the cringe campaign that I so aptly dub it, is that he just was not able to get past his own ego and narcissism, even though he was, apparently a very lonely, unfortunate dude who was he clearly just wanted to have friends and people to play with and have a good time with, but he was not willing, as Sam said, to compromise and to maybe even more than just compromise, like, at this point, maybe cater a little bit to his players and to learn and to accept that, hey, maybe you aren't as infallible or whatever as you think you are. And maybe you should do a lot of introspection to get to a point where you can actually play a game with people. Like, oh my God, you can't even play a game together with people cohesively? Like, I can't even imagine what it's like in other aspects of your life, my man. Like, no offense intended, but just like, dude, this right here, like, we are all here to try and have a good time. This is like the base bottom level of trying to be able to like live synonymous, what's the word I'm looking for?
Vicariously.
Harmoniously. To live harmoniously with people, right?
Oh,
yeah, no, it's fine. It's like we all live vicariously through our characters in this world. But it's like, we like to interact harmoniously with people and synergetically with people, to be able to, like, on the most baseline interact. with other people and compromise. Like this is like the one of the most baseline compromises that you can really do. We're playing a game, and while this game, and in my opinion, I think you might agree too, Sam, is something that is very special and important to us, and that we prize a lot. It is still a game at the end of the day that is for our enjoyment and our happiness, and that it should be something that's like, hey, this isn't going to like fucking kill us if we're not able to get this the way we exactly want it to be. It's not going to like destroy our lives. It might make it a little less happy and a little less pleasant and colorful, so to speak. But it's,
I think there's, the whole, if it's not going to be fun, don't play it at all is a good way to look at it, because it's worse to play a shitty D&D game than to play no D&D.
No D&D is better than bad D&D.
The reality is like, it is a game. It's something that a lot of people who play it care about it quite immensely. They have a good time with it. And there are times we will walk away from sessions where it was a tense session, it was stressful. But overall, your reaction to playing D&D, whether you're a GM, whether you're a player, should be a positive one. There's obviously always going to be things that certain people don't like, and always going to be things that happen that you may not be satisfied with. But it should be an overall positive experience for both parties. And if it's not, then there's either something wrong with what your experience is or what's being given to you at the table, and you have to look and figure out what that is to make those choices. And I think that's, because sometimes I've met people that have played the game and they're like, it wasn't really very fun, but everyone else had fun. And I was like, well, what about it is the thing? And they found out that it had more to do with themselves than anybody else at the table. And so it's like one of those things where it's like, sometimes it's not even a problem player or a problem GM. It's just not a good fit.
Not a good fit, game or somebody, or like you said, it's internal, where a person is like, they maybe even feel a little bit disappointed or sad that they aren't having as much fun as everybody else, right? Yeah. And they don't necessarily even know why. And like you said, it could just be like, maybe they're just not really, they don't jive with D&D, right? They just don't really sync up with or harmonize with what D&D presents and can supply. And so it's like, they see everybody else at the table having a great time and really getting into it and having fun. And even though they're like doing the same thing, it's like they just don't get as much out of it. And then they feel, disappointed, or they feel maybe a bit jealous or envious or resentful or whatever. And like I said, maybe just not a good fit for D&D as a whole, which, that's not a bad thing.
There are other options out there. D&D is, by far not the only TTRPG.
Oh, it is not at all, but if it's another reason, it's like, well, it is maybe still a matter of yourself, where you're just like, hey, just, maybe you need to branch out a bit. You need, like, this game requires people to be a little bit more extroverted, in the sense of like looking outside of just yourself, because that's the nature. This is a cooperative storytelling game. You have to work with other people, meaning you have to, for the most part, come out of yourself to interact, engage, and compromise, and to interact with these people harmoniously and positively in a healthy manner. Like, that's how, again, you GM correctly, that's how you play correctly.
Yeah. And it's hard. I mean, obviously me and you have had our experiences, which is why we can even talk about it at all. But the reality is that a lot of people have never necessarily had this problem or these problems, because either they haven't played, or they played with one group and now they're looking for a new one because that group's gone and they haven't had these experiences. But there's things to look for, and it's definitely like your first session with a group is going to tell you a lot about how the rest of them are going to go. And there's obviously opportunities for change, but it's about how receptive someone is to that before you can really make the call of like, is this really something I want to stick with in this way? Because sometimes it's just not worth it. And like, it's okay if it's not worth it to go find something different.
It's okay. Again, like we said, go, if you are the type of person that maybe can't really come out of your shell too much, you can't be more extroverted, like, go play Baldur's Gate. Like we said, like, this one of the biggest aspects we want to touch upon again is the parallels and lack of parallels in Baldur's Gate to transferring over to tabletop D&D. And that, like Sam was saying before, like, some of the issues maybe that can arise from that is that people's expectation of what D&D is maybe won't be accurate and might in fact lead to some unfortunate experiences because they think it's going to be like Baldur's Gate,
like a video game.
Yeah, like a video game, which is, again, there are parallels, there are similarities to some extent, but the biggest aspect of it is that you are not just playing by yourself. And even even if you are playing by yourself, like, or rather, if for instance, if you're not even just playing by yourself, but let's say you're playing with a group of friends, even in Baldur's Gate, right?
Oh, there's a huge difference between playing with friends.
You play with your friends in Baldur's Gate. You can do all kinds of crazy, ridiculous stuff, and because again, it's a video game, there are, even within Baldur's Gate that has a ridiculous amount of these things, there are still a limited amount of ways that world can respond and react to the choices and actions that you do inside of it and that you choose inside of it. Whereas in D&D, the sky's the limit just about with the GM. The GM can choose just about any kind of reaction to the decisions that you make. And your actions and everything else are far more consequential and heavy than they would be in Baldur's Gate. Because even in Baldur's Gate, you can instantly just, save scum to go back if you make a decision or a choice. It doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want, and it has a limited amount of reactions to it. That is the experience of a video game. A tabletop RPG is not the same thing.
No,
because it's about you establishing and making a story yourself as you go, being immersed in the world. It's supposed to be as close between reality and fantasy as possible. It's supposed to be in that balance. Like, you're supposed to find that little bit right there. Okay. And that, in essence, is the magic of it. And that's also why it won't be the same as a video game.
No. And not to say that you can't, if you're playing multiplayer, you can't annoy the crap out of the people you play with, because you can make decisions.
Oh, that's what I'm saying. You absolutely can.
You can make decisions in that game without your party having any input because you're the first person that talked to somebody. And so
you're the one in the cutscene.
That's a good parallel to D&D in the sense that, like, if you do things without thinking about the players that are sitting next to you or in the little camera square next to you while you play, you're going to have problems not just between you and the game itself or the DM, but you're going to have problems with the players next to you. And I think that's something to take away as something to think about, because, like, I've played some multiplayer Baldur's Gate, and not only does it take about 8 times longer than single player, you have to check at every turn what you're gonna do. Like, what do we want to do here? What do we want to do? Like, otherwise someone's gonna do something and be like, what the fuck? Like, so it's the same thing with D&D is like, you don't, like, to be fair, in normal D&D, I think making character-based decisions out of the blue is, I think, more acceptable than in maybe Baldur's Gate or a similar kind of multiplayer game. The reason being is that there is kind of a social contract in D&D that you've kind of all agreed to deal with each other's characters and personalities beforehand.
Again, to a certain extent,
of course. Like, obviously, we've talked about this before. Making decisions that are detrimental to the rest of your party specifically because of what your character wants to do is something that is supposed to happen few and far in between. And, like, it can happen once or twice as, like, an honest mistake, as, like, an honest, like, well, my character doesn't really know y'all yet, so they are going to make the decision that's best for them. But that there's, again, as we've talked about many times, there has to be growth from that point.
That needs to eventually go away. You make characters with those kinds of personality traits, or, maybe more problematic aspects, specifically so that they can learn to grow and shift out of those things, to get above that, not to make that a permanent staple of your character where you just become, again, a detriment to your party, or a troll or a douche or whatever. Like, you make those traits specifically so that your character can learn to grow past them, so that you have some kind of character development. And it provides you with a bit more sense of immersion and care about the character and the world at large, and also hopefully your party members,
Yeah. It's a very complicated thing, and it's a back and forth. I mean,
it's just people at the end of the day. It's about people being able to interact with one another. That's always some of the most complicated things, because people make things far more complicated than they need to be a lot of the time. People just, people can't help themselves. People don't know what they feel. especially in the moment when they're like having an immediate reaction to things. And, you know, it's difficult. It's difficult to sort through your feelings when you have a lot of them and you feel them intensely. And maybe you've never really had to sort through them before. And especially having to deal with other people on top of that, it can be hard. But at the end of the day, that is one thing that is also great about this game, is that it does hopefully prompt people to learn how to compromise, handle, deal with, and shift with other people. Because again, if you really connect, this game has the ability to help people really truly connect with one another and have amazing moments and experiences and memories and to craft that kind of thing that you know, it's hard pressed to find anywhere else in a lot of ways, because you guys are basically, you're making a world together. You're being like, you know, adults are being kids again together with this kind of thing. You know, you're getting some of that magic in your life, and that's always super helpful. And, you know, hopefully you'd have a group of people that are looking to be constructive and want to cultivate that rather than to corrupt it and use it as a means of like trolling people and messing with them and getting your, you know, your jibbies off or whatever, you know, to just at the expense of everybody else. You know, you'd want to be hopefully more constructive with each other rather than destructive, I would hope.
You assume, right?
I mean, you would hope. You know,
it's almost like you'd assume someone wants to be positive and constructive when playing a cooperative game.
Yeah, you know, you'd think, and that's interesting, right? It's like co-op. I've always loved co-op games so much, but man, people make it hard sometimes, bro. It's just like, but you know what, y'all? I think that's about all we really got for you today. So unless Sam, you got something else you want to say, I think
I think that was a good point to end on.
Yeah, I think we finally got I think we got the second part of it out. I think we all got the rest of it out. And you know, like we said, like we just hope that anybody coming who gets interested in, like, from Baldur's Gate, Skyrim, Divinity, whatever game, you know, that might kind of help as a springboard over into tabletop. If you want to give tabletop a try, absolutely. You know, it is an amazing hobby and experience and thing to do with new people. It's a great way to meet new people. It's a great way to have fun with old people, with non-new people, you know. But as we said, we would just hope that if you do so, please come at it from the place of wanting to cooperate with people, to cooperate with your parties and your friends, once more, to a reasonable extent. Not to the extent that, like Sam said before, like, don't be a doormat. You know, don't come into a situation or a game, because that's absolutely also a thing that maybe we didn't touch on, is that, like, people can come into a game and be like, oh, I guess this is just how D&D is supposed to be played. And you have, like, people who are just, like, you know, murdering everything, killing everything, and doing, like, some really nasty or disgusting things or acts in game. And it's like, hey, no, you don't have to be okay with that or go along with that. If that doesn't feel good or right to you, which hopefully it wouldn't, but you know, some people just like to just be insane and crazy or whatever. They just like that outlet, I guess. You don't have to go along with that. You don't have to be okay with that. You can find another party, a better party for you. Yeah. You don't ever have to feel trapped. You don't ever have to feel like you don't ever have opportunity. There are so many people. Go to, like, D&D Beyond and go on the forums, right? Go on, like, the party search forum. You can find all kinds of players, parties, GMs, always looking for people and players to be in a game. You know, you can go online, you can find all kinds of different places, like on Discord. Like, there are tons of different Discord servers who are always looking for games and people to play with and all that. There's always a way for you to find the right party for you. You don't have to feel like you're stuck in this wrong party, because that, you know, it should be about you having fun and being cooperative and constructive with the people around you, not destructive or draining.
Or detrimental, like your mental health. This is about your mental health almost entirely, honestly. And so if you're not even, like, doing that, then there's no point overall. But with that, you know, thank you guys. We love and appreciate y'all if you stayed with us this long, and please leave again some comments down below. You know, let us know maybe some of your problem issues and maybe ways that you got around them, maybe some of your more cringy, funny little stories that you had, maybe some, you know,
GM mistakes that you made, or some player mistakes that you made. Do you feel like maybe you exhibit certain personality traits like this that might be a bit problematic, or that you might feel like you need to like address or adjust a little bit, maybe? Let us know.
Anything you want us to talk about as well. We're kind of just running through ideas we come up with. So if people want to hear specific things,
let us know what you guys want us to kind of talk about a bit. So, again, thank you guys so much. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe if you haven't. And we'll see y'all again real soon. Appreciate you.
Thank y'all.
Bye now.